In the unfathomable depths of the immaterium, where raw emotion and psychic energy coalesce into sentient form, Khorne emerged as perhaps the oldest of the Chaos gods. Long before the Emperor walked Terra, before mankind reached for the stars, the entity that would become the Blood God stirred in the warp, feeding on the violent impulses of the galaxy's first sentient species. The origins of Khorne trace back to the most primordial days of sentient existence in the galaxy, during what Imperial scholars would later term the Age of Terra. While exact chronology remains impossible to establish when dealing with warp entities that exist partially outside conventional time, most demon hunter inquisitors believe Khorne's consciousness first coalesced during humanity's earliest tribal conflicts. Archaeological evidence from Terra's ancient battlefields, arrow-pierced skulls, crushed bone fragments, and primitive weapons stained with millennia-old blood all bear psychic imprints that resonate with Khorne's particular warp signature. However, it would be a mistake to attribute the birth of Khorne solely to humanity. The Eldar, whose civilization predated human ascendancy by millions of years, have ancient texts referencing entities matching Khorne's description from their earliest days. Similarly, Eldari myth cycles speak of the bloody-handed hunter, who stalked their ancestors across the stars long before their empire reached its zenith. This suggests that Khorne fed on the violence of multiple species simultaneously, growing stronger as each new race discovered the brutal efficiency of organized warfare. Unlike Slaanesh, whose birth during the fall of the Eldar can be pinpointed to a specific cataclysmic moment, Khorne's emergence was a gradual process spanning thousands of years. Each battle fought, each life violently ended, each drop of blood spilled in anger, all contributed microscopic amounts of psychic energy that slowly accumulated in a specific region of the warp. This process accelerated as sentient species developed more sophisticated weapons and tactics, allowing for bloodshed on increasingly massive scales. By the time humanity had unified Terra under various competing empires during the Age of Strife, Khorne had already established himself as one of the four major powers in the immaterium. His domain within the realm of chaos reflected his nature, a blood-soaked landscape of endless battlefields stretching beyond comprehension, where the souls of the violent dead fight eternal wars for their dark master's amusement. At the heart of Khorne's realm stands the Brass Citadel, a monument to martial prowess and violent conquest that defies mortal understanding. The citadel itself is forged from brass, bronze, and blackened iron, materials that symbolize Khorne's martial nature and rejection of sorcery or trickery. Its foundations are said to be built upon a mountain of skulls, each one representing a worthy warrior slain in battle across the millennia. The exact dimensions of the Brass Citadel fluctuate with Khorne's power and mood, sometimes appearing as a relatively modest fortress, other times expanding to continental proportions. The psychic energies that formed Khorne came primarily from specific emotional and conceptual sources. Bloodshed served as the fundamental building block, with each violent death releasing minute amounts of psychic energy into the warp. Martial pride contributed another crucial element. The satisfaction warriors felt in their combat skills and battlefield victories resonated particularly strongly with the forming consciousness of the Blood God. Perhaps most significantly, the concept of honorable combat provided a structural framework that distinguished Khorne from being merely a mindless vortex of violence. This last element explains one of Khorne's most defining characteristics, his hatred of sorcery and trickery. From his earliest manifestation, Khorne embodied the concept of direct confrontation and victory through strength and skill rather than deception or manipulation. This aspect of his nature placed him in direct opposition to Tzeentch, the chaos god of change and sorcery, establishing one of the fundamental rivalries within the great game that the chaos gods eternally play against one another. The formation of Khorne's consciousness also established the core principles that would define his relationship with mortal followers. Unlike the other chaos gods, Khorne cares not from where the blood flows, only that it does. This maxim, repeated endlessly by his followers, reflects his fundamental nature as a force of indiscriminate violence. Khorne does not favor specific species, tactics, or causes. He rewards only those who spill blood in his name, regardless of their origins or motivations. Khorne's earliest mortal followers were likely primitive tribal warriors who unwittingly channeled his influence through their battle rage. Archaeological evidence from ancient Terra shows curious similarities between warrior cults separated by vast distances and time periods. The use of brass ornamentation, skull trophies, and ritualized combat challenges appear across otherwise unconnected cultures. These parallels suggest Khorne's influence reached into the material realm long before mortals consciously worshipped him. The blood god's relationship with the other chaos powers evolved alongside his growing consciousness. While all four major chaos gods ultimately emerged from the same psychic substrate, their conceptual domains naturally placed them in opposition. Khorne's direct, martial approach clashed with Tzeentch's schemes and sorcery. His demand for immediate violence contradicted Nurgle's patient, entropic decay, and his focus on physical prowess and bloodshed stood at odds with Slaanesh's pursuit of sensory perfection and excess. Within the brass citadel, Khorne sits upon the skull throne, a massive seat of power built from the skulls of champions slain in battle across millions of worlds and countless millennia. The first skulls incorporated into this grisly monument likely came from forgotten warriors of species now extinct, their names and deeds remembered only by the blood god himself. As Khorne's power grew, so too did his throne, with particularly worthy skulls, those of great champions, psychers, and even minor warp entities, occupying positions of prominence. The landscape surrounding the brass citadel reflects Khorne's nature in physical form. Rivers of blood flow across plains of broken bone and scorched earth. The skies burn with the red of fresh slaughter, occasionally split by brass lightning that strikes those who show cowardice or hesitation. Armies of the dead clash eternally across these hellish battlefields, their souls claimed by Khorne to fight forever in his name. Khorne's earliest demons emerged as extensions of his will, formed from the conceptual building blocks that created the blood god himself. Bloodletters, his most common demonic servants, embody the killing stroke, the moment when blade meets flesh and blood is spilled. Their red skin, brass armor, and hellblades physically represent the essential components of Khorne's power. Juggernauts, the massive demonic steeds that carry Khorne's champions, manifest the unstoppable momentum of a battlefield charge, while flesh hounds embody the relentless pursuit of fleeing enemies. More powerful entities soon formed within Khorne's realm. The first bloodthirsters, his greater demons, represented the pinnacle of martial prowess and bloodlust combined. Each was crafted to embody a specific aspect of warfare, some representing the fury of close combat, others the tactical genius of battlefield command, still others the terror inspired by an unstoppable warrior. The most powerful of these, the Eight, were given dominion over specific aspects of Khorne's realm and sent to lead his armies against rival chaos gods and mortal worlds alike. The relationship between Khorne and the material realm operates through a complex system of psychic feedback. Violence in real space feeds Khorne's power in the warp, while his influence seeps back into the material universe, inspiring further bloodshed. This cycle accelerated dramatically as sentient species developed more sophisticated technologies of warfare, allowing violence on previously impossible scales. By the time humanity had developed its first interstellar civilizations, Khorne had established himself as perhaps the most straightforward yet potent of the Chaos Gods. His influence could be seen in the territorial wars that plagued human expansion, the martial traditions that developed on frontier worlds, and the bloody suppression of rebellious colonies. Though few humans consciously worshipped the blood god during this period, his mark was evident in the escalating brutality of warfare and the glorification of military conquest. The Age of Strife provided Khorne with unprecedented psychic sustenance as human worlds turned against one another in a desperate struggle for survival. Without the unifying presence of the Emperor, humanity fractured into warring factions, each fighting with increasing desperation as warp storms isolated their worlds and resources dwindled. The bloodshed of this era strengthened Khorne dramatically, allowing him to extend his influence even further into the material realm. Within the realm of chaos, Khorne's growing power manifested in the expansion of his domain and the increasing sophistication of his demonic legions. The brass citadel grew to impossible proportions, its spires reaching into the warp sky like the teeth of some monstrous predator. New forms of demons emerged to serve specific combat functions, and Khorne's armies became more organized and tactically proficient, reflecting the Blood God's appreciation for martial skill alongside raw violence. The Blood God's relationship with mortal champions also evolved during this period. Rather than simply accepting the worship of any who spilled blood, Khorne began to take a more active role in selecting and testing potential followers. Warriors who distinguished themselves through exceptional violence might receive subtle blessings, enhanced strength, unnatural combat instincts, or resistance to enemy attacks. Those who continued to impress the Blood God might receive more substantial gifts, including demonic weapons or physical mutations that enhanced their killing potential. As the Age of Strife gave way to the Great Crusade, Khorne observed the Emperor's unification of humanity with particular interest. Here was a being of unprecedented psychic power, leading armies that conquered through overwhelming military might rather than diplomacy or compromise. Though the Emperor opposed chaos in all its forms, the bloodshed unleashed by his legions Astartes nonetheless fed Khorne's power, creating a paradoxical relationship that would have profound consequences during the Horus Heresy. The martial traditions established by the Space Marine legions, particularly those that emphasized close combat prowess and battlefield glory, unknowingly echoed aspects of Khorne's own martial code. The World Eaters, Blood Angels, and White Scars, with their emphasis on shock assault and melee combat, created psychic resonances that Khorne found particularly appealing. This affinity would later provide pathways for corruption, most notably in the case of Angron and his World Eaters, who would eventually become Khorne's most devoted servants. The Brass Citadel looms as the ultimate monument to violence in the ever-shifting landscape of the warp. Unlike the crumbling ruins or organic structures that characterize the domains of other chaos gods, Khorne's fortress presents a brutal architectural efficiency that reflects its master's straightforward nature. Massive walls of burnished brass rise thousands of feet high, their surfaces etched with scenes of legendary battles fought across countless worlds. These carvings are not static. They shift subtly as new conflicts erupt in the material realm, the most glorious massacres earning permanent commemoration on the Citadel's exterior. 8 great towers anchor the Citadel's perimeter, each representing one of the Blood God's sacred numbers. These spires stretch beyond comprehension, their heights impossible to measure by mortal standards as they pierce the crimson skies of Khorne's realm. Each tower serves as a barracks for specific types of Khorne's demonic legions. Bloodletters occupy the first, Fleshhounds the second, and so forth, with the 8th and tallest reserved for the elite bloodthirsters of the Blood God's personal guard. Between these towers stretch massive walls studded with skull-shaped battlements and weapon emplacements that constantly fire into the surrounding wastelands. These weapons discharge not conventional ammunition, but concentrated hatred and rage, manifested as brass projectiles that explode into shrapnel when striking their targets. The gates of the Citadel stand as tall as Titan war machines, forged from blackened iron, mixed with the melted-down weapons of champions who failed Khorne in battle. These massive portals never close, a testament to Khorne's confidence that no force would dare assault his seat of power directly. The architecture of the Brass Citadel follows no recognizable pattern from the material realm. Staircases spiral upward only to invert themselves halfway, leading both up and down simultaneously. Hallways stretch for what seems like miles before abruptly terminating in weapon-filled chambers where bloodletters hone their combat skills. Arenas dot the interior where captured souls and lesser demons fight for the amusement of Khorne's chosen champions. The entire structure pulses with a heartbeat like rhythm, the walls themselves occasionally seeping with fresh blood that runs down to feed the rivers surrounding the fortress. 8 massive rivers of blood encircle the Brass Citadel, each flowing from a different source and carrying distinct properties. The first and largest, known as the Cauldron of Rage, springs directly from beneath Khorne's skull throne, carrying the concentrated fury of the Blood God himself. This river burns those who touch it, not with heat but with uncontrollable battle rage that drives even the most disciplined beings into mindless violence. The second river, the Flayer's Flow, carries dissolved flesh and tissue, representing the aftermath of battle rather than the conflict itself. The third, called the Crimson Path, contains the blood of worthy champions slain in Khorne's name, its surface occasionally revealing faces of the deceased frozen in their final battle cries. The remaining 5 rivers bear the essences of specific emotions tied to combat. One carries the exhilaration of victory, another the desperation of last stands, the third flows with the terror of the hunted, the fourth pulses with the determination of the outnumbered, and the fifth, smallest river contains the pure satisfaction of a kill well executed. These rivers converge beyond the citadel's outer perimeter to form a vast ocean of blood that marks the boundary between Khorne's domain and the territories of rival chaos gods. Unlike water in the material realm, the blood in these rivers flows according to the tides of battle across the galaxy. When major conflicts erupt on numerous worlds simultaneously, the rivers swell and accelerate, sometimes overflowing their banks to flood the surrounding plains. During rare periods of relative peace, they recede and slow, though they never stop completely, a testament to the constant presence of violence somewhere in the material universe. The blood itself varies in consistency and color depending on its source, bright red and thin when flowing with the blood of recently slain mortals, dark and thick when carrying the essence of demons destroyed in the great game between chaos powers. The surrounding landscape of Khorne's realm defies consistent description, as it shifts constantly with the tides of the warp. Vast plains of compacted bone fragments stretch for impossible distances, interrupted by mountains formed from the weapons of the defeated. These mountains periodically erupt, not with lava, but with molten brass that flows down their slopes to form new features in the landscape. Forests of swords grow in some regions, each blade representing a life taken in particularly impressive combat. The trees in these forests grow taller with each kill attributed to the weapon, creating a constantly evolving canopy of lethal metal. The skies above Khorne's domain burn eternally red, occasionally split by brass-colored lightning that strikes those who display cowardice or hesitation. No sun exists in this realm, yet visibility remains perfect across vast distances, all the better for Khorne to witness the endless battles that rage across his territory. Clouds formed from concentrated rage occasionally release downpours of blood that nourish the soil and cause new weapon forests to sprout wherever they fall. Weather patterns in Khorne's realm correspond directly to events in the material universe. Major campaigns like the Armageddon conflicts or the Damocles Gulf Crusade create massive storm systems that rage for what might be years in warp time. The defense of Cadia against Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade generated such atmospheric disturbance that entire regions of Khorne's domain were reshaped by the psychic backlash of so much concentrated bloodshed. At the heart of the brass citadel sits the legendary Skull Throne, the seat of Khorne's power and authority. Crafted from the craniums of countless champions, both loyal and enemy, the throne stands hundreds of feet tall and continues to grow as new worthy skulls are added to its structure. The oldest skulls at the throne's foundation date back to species long extinct, their names forgotten by all save Khorne himself. These ancient trophies have calcified into material harder than adamantium, providing an unbreakable foundation for the newer additions. The placement of skulls within the throne follows a precise hierarchy understood only by Khorne. The most honored position, the armrests of the throne, are formed from the skulls of the greatest champions who ever opposed the Blood God. Space Marine chapter masters, Eldari autarchs, and even a handful of particularly martial primarchs who fell in battle have their craniums incorporated here, their eye sockets often filled with blood-red gemstones that continue to perceive the realm around them. The seat of the throne consists primarily of powerful psychers and sorcerers, Khorne's way of showing contempt for those who would use warp craft rather than honest strength to achieve victory. The base of the throne contains millions of skulls from worthy but lesser opponents, Imperial guardsmen who died holding their positions against impossible odds, orc knobs who led particularly devastating wars, and tyrannid warrior forms that displayed unusual tactical acumen. These skulls are arranged in patterns that, when viewed from certain angles, form Khorne's personal rune, a stylized symbol representing bloodshed and martial prowess. Most disturbing to those few mortals who have glimpsed the throne and survived to tell of it are the skulls that retain some semblance of animation. The most worthy opponents sometimes maintain a spark of consciousness, even after their incorporation into the throne. Their jaws occasionally move in silent screams, or their empty eye sockets track movement across Khorne's throne room. These preserved consciousness fragments serve both as trophies and advisors, their military expertise sometimes consulted by Khorne when planning campaigns against rival chaos gods. The symbolic significance of brass permeates every aspect of Khorne's realm. Unlike gold, which represents wealth and luxury, or silver, which suggests purity and reflection, brass embodies martial functionality. It is the metal of war instruments, from the simplest trumpet calling troops to battle to the casings of bolter shells. Brass does not tarnish easily, but develops a patina that speaks to its use and history. This quality mirrors Khorne's appreciation for battle-hardened veterans over untested warriors. The brass components of Khorne's realm, from the citadel itself to the weapons of his demonic legions, are forged in massive foundries located beneath the plains of bone. These foundries are operated by lesser demons and the souls of metalworkers who showed particular skill in crafting weapons during their mortal lives. The heat for these forges comes not from conventional fire, but from concentrated rage siphoned directly from battlefields in the material realm. This psychic energy burns hot enough to melt even the most resistant metals, allowing for the creation of weapons that could never exist under normal physical laws. Blood serves as the most obvious and fundamental symbol in Khorne's iconography. It represents both life force and its violent release, the transition from living being to dead matter that occurs in battle. Within Khorne's realm, blood functions as both currency and sustenance. His demons drink it to maintain their manifestations, his champions bathe in it to receive blessings, and the most favored servants are permitted to add their blood to Khorne's personal chalice, a massive vessel kept beside the skull throne that constantly circulates the combined blood of the blood god's greatest champions. The blood that flows through Khorne's realm carries memories and experiences. Demons who drink from the rivers of blood temporarily gain access to the combat knowledge of those whose vidi they consume. Champions who immerse themselves in these rivers might experience visions of ancient battles or receive insights into fighting techniques long forgotten in the material realm. This transfer of martial knowledge ensures that Khorne's followers constantly improve their combat abilities, incorporating strategies and techniques from across time and space. Skulls represent the third major symbolic element in Khorne's domain. While blood symbolizes the act of killing and brass represents the means, skulls stand as the permanent record of victory. Every skull taken in Khorne's name contains a fragment of its owner's essence, not enough to maintain consciousness, but sufficient to preserve the echo of their final moments. This psychic residue allows Khorne to revisit particularly satisfying kills, experiencing the moment of death from both the perspective of the victor and the vanquished. The collection and display of skulls follows strict protocols within Khorne's forces. Only skulls taken from worthy opponents count toward a champion's tally. 1,000 skulls from cowards or non-combatants mean less to Khorne than a single cranium from an opponent who died fighting bravely. The method of skull taking also matters. Those removed in direct combat rank higher than those collected after battle. The highest honor goes to skulls taken in single combat between champions of roughly equal skill. The warp itself serves as both medium and message in Khorne's realm. Unlike the material universe with its fixed physical laws, the immaterium responds directly to emotion and belief. This responsiveness means that Khorne's domain constantly shifts to reflect the changing nature of warfare across the galaxy. When a particular combat style becomes prevalent in real space conflicts, corresponding features appear in the landscape of Khorne's realm. The rise of siege warfare during the Horus Heresy created massive fortification mountains that still stand in certain regions. The tank battles of Armageddon-generated plains perfectly suited for demonic war machines to conduct maneuvers. This relationship between material battles and warp geography works both ways. Features that develop naturally in Khorne's realm sometimes influence military leaders in real space, inspiring them to adopt tactics or formations that mirror those used by Khorne's demonic legions. Imperial tacticians have occasionally noted disturbing similarities between the battle plans of completely unconnected commanders fighting on opposite sides of the galaxy. similarities that can only be explained by both leaders drawing inspiration from the same warp-born source. The constant flux of Khorne's realm makes mapping it impossible, even for his most devoted servants. Landmarks that stood for millennia might vanish overnight if their corresponding concepts lose relevance in material warfare. New features emerge constantly as innovative combat techniques develop across the galaxy. Only the brass citadel and the skull throne remain truly constant, immovable anchors in an otherwise fluid landscape that embody the eternal nature of Khorne himself. Beyond the rivers of blood and the brass architecture of his domain lies something far more fundamental to understanding Khorne, his unyielding ethos. The blood god operates according to a strict martial code that, while seemingly straightforward, contains nuances and contradictions that have confounded imperial scholars for millennia. At its core, Khorne's philosophy revolves around the concept of martial honor. Unlike the other chaos gods who revel in deception, manipulation, excess, or decay, Khorne demands directness from his followers. A true devotee of the blood god faces enemies head-on, relying on skill, strength, and courage rather than trickery or subterfuge. This principle explains why Khorne's champions typically eschew heavy armor in favor of more minimal protection. They believe victory should come from personal ability rather than technological advantage. This emphasis on martial honor manifests in the blood god's famous hatred for sorcery. Khorne views psychic powers as fundamentally dishonest, a means of circumventing the true test of combat by attacking from a distance through immaterial means. Psykers who rely on warp energy rather than physical prowess earn particular contempt from Khorne and his followers. Inquisitorial records document numerous instances where Khaornate warbands have specifically targeted enemy psykers on the battlefield, ignoring tactically valuable targets to eliminate what they consider dishonorable combatants. The blood god's disdain for sorcery places him in direct opposition to Tzeentch, creating one of the most enduring rivalries within the great game of chaos. While Tzeentch's followers weave complex psychic workings to achieve their goals, Khorne's devotees take pride in their rejection of such methods. This antipathy extends even to technological equivalents of psychic power. Many Khaornate champions refuse to use ranged weapons, viewing them as only marginally more acceptable than outright sorcery. Cowardice ranks as the cardinal sin in Khorne's ethical framework. To flee from battle, to surrender when victory remains possible, or to attack only the weak while avoiding stronger opponents, these actions draw Khorne's wrath more surely than any other transgression. His demons ruthlessly hunt those who display cowardice, with flesh hounds particularly attuned to the scent of fear. Even devoted champions who have served Khorne faithfully for centuries might find themselves abandoned or punished if they show reluctance in the face of overwhelming odds. This intolerance for cowardice explains one of Khorne's most famous maxims: Khorne cares not from where the blood flows, only that it does. The blood god respects strength and courage regardless of their source. An imperial guardsman making a last stand against impossible odds may receive Khorne's momentary approval, even as the blood god simultaneously blesses the Chaos Space Marines cutting him down. This principle creates situations where Khorne effectively backs both sides of a conflict, ensuring maximum bloodshed while rewarding whoever demonstrates the greatest martial prowess. Perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of Khorne's ethos concerns his relationship with indiscriminate slaughter. Popular imperial propaganda portrays Khaornate berserkers as mindless butchers who kill without thought or purpose. While such individuals certainly exist among Khorne's followers, they represent the lowest tier of his servants rather than his ideal. The blood god values quality of kills over quantity, a concept illustrated by the careful hierarchical arrangement of skulls on his throne. A champion who slaughters 100 unarmed civilians might receive less favor than one who defeats a single worthy opponent in honorable combat. This preference manifests in the gifts Khorne bestows upon his followers. Those who seek out the strongest enemies to test themselves against receive enhancements to their combat abilities, while those who prey exclusively on the weak might find their blessings taking more bestial forms, reducing them to little more than hunting animals in Khorne's service. The collection of skulls serves as the physical manifestation of Khorne's value system. Each skull taken represents not just a kill, but a test overcome, a challenge met, a moment of martial triumph. The practice began with Khorne's first mortal followers, primitive warriors who kept the skulls of defeated chieftains as proof of their victories. As Khorne's influence spread, the custom evolved into a formal religious practice, with specific rituals governing how skulls should be collected, prepared, and presented. For Khornate champions, the quality of skulls in their collection directly reflects their standing in the blood god's eyes. A champion might carry hundreds of skulls, but those from particularly formidable opponents receive special treatment, mounted on pauldrons, affixed to weapon hilts, or incorporated into personal banners. The most prized skulls come from enemy champions, psychers, and warriors who died fighting to their last breath rather than surrendering. Blood serves as the second component of Khorne's tribute system. While skulls represent the permanent record of victory, blood embodies the act of combat itself, the moment when skill, strength, and determination translate into physical damage. Khornate rituals often involve bloodletting, with warriors offering their own viti alongside that of their enemies. This practice acknowledges that true combat involves risk to both participants. A warrior unwilling to bleed for Khorne is unworthy of his blessing. The blood spilled in Khorne's name carries different values depending on its source. The blood of worthy warriors, those who fight with skill and courage, provides the most potent offering. Blood shed in single combat between evenly matched opponents holds particular significance, as it represents the purest expression of martial contest. Conversely, blood from unwilling or helpless victims provides minimal sustenance to the blood god, explaining why his most devoted servants seek out the strongest opponents rather than the easiest kills. This tiered value system creates a paradoxical aspect to Khorne's ethos. While his followers seek to spill blood in enormous quantities, they simultaneously strive to ensure that blood comes from worthy sources. This contradiction drives Khornate warbands to seek out the most formidable fighting forces in the galaxy, Space Marine chapters, Eldari aspect warriors, or orc warbosses, rather than wasting time on targets that offer little challenge. Khorne's respect for martial prowess extends beyond species boundaries, creating situations where his followers might spare particularly skilled opponents to ensure future battles. Inquisitorial records document cases where Khornate champions have withdrawn from combat after defeating worthy adversaries, leaving them alive, but taking trophies such as weapons or armor. These items become relics within Khornate warbands, symbols of respected enemies who might one day provide another satisfying test of skill. This respect for skilled opponents sometimes manifests in ritualized combat practices. Before major engagements, Khornate champions often challenge enemy leaders to single combat, offering the chance to settle conflicts through individual duels rather than mass warfare. While Imperial commanders typically reject such offers, some warrior cultures, particularly among Space Marines and certain Astra Militarum regiments, have occasionally accepted these challenges, seeing them as opportunities to decapitate enemy command structures. The paradox between Khorne's demand for honorable combat and his desire for maximum bloodshed creates tension within his followers. Some Khornate champions lean heavily toward the honor aspect, developing elaborate personal codes that dictate whom they will fight and under what circumstances. These individuals might refuse to attack unarmed opponents, announce their presence before striking, or even allow enemies to retrieve dropped weapons during combat. Such warriors typically lead smaller warbands focused on quality of combat rather than quantity of kills. At the opposite extreme stand the berserkers who embody pure bloodlust with minimal concern for honor. These followers, often under the influence of the butcher's nails or similar enhancements, seek only to kill in the largest numbers possible. They make no distinction between armed warriors and defenseless civilians, viewing all living beings as simply vessels of blood waiting to be opened. While such indiscriminate slaughterers serve Khorne's purpose of maximizing bloodshed, they rarely receive his highest blessings or attain champion status. Most of Khorne's mortal followers fall somewhere between these extremes, balancing the competing demands of honor and carnage according to their personal interpretation of the blood god's will. A typical Khornate warband might focus primarily on military targets while in combat zones, but resort to civilian massacres when worthy opponents prove scarce. This flexibility allows Khorne's followers to adapt to changing battlefield conditions while still adhering to the broad principles of their faith. The Blood God's ethos regarding weaponry further illustrates the complexity of his martial code. Khorne favors melee weapons over ranged options, seeing direct combat as more honorable than attacking from a distance. Within the category of melee weapons, those that cause maximum bloodshed receive particular favor: chain axes, chain swords, and serrated blades that tear flesh rather than making clean cuts. The iconic weapon of Khorne's followers, the chain axe, perfectly embodies this preference, combining the brutal splitting power of an axe with the flesh-rendering capabilities of motorized teeth. Despite this preference for melee combat, Khorne does not entirely reject ranged weapons or technology. His followers make extensive use of jump packs to close distances quickly, and many Khornate champions employ bolt pistols as sidearms for dealing with enemies before reaching melee range. The key distinction lies in how these tools are used. Technology that enables or enhances direct combat receives approval, while methods that replace personal combat with remote killing earn disdain. This nuanced view of technology extends to bodily enhancements. Khorne readily blesses his followers with mutations that increase combat effectiveness, enhanced musculature, thickened bone structure, or reinforced tendons that allow for greater striking power. However, these blessings typically preserve the recipient's agency and skill rather than replacing them with mindless fury. Even the notorious butcher's nails, while inducing rage, do not completely eliminate the tactical acumen of experienced warriors. They simply redirect it toward more aggressive applications. The Blood God's perspective on defensive equipment reveals another facet of his complex ethos. While imperial propaganda often depicts Khornate berserkers as unarmored savages, the reality proves more nuanced. Khorne's followers typically wear armor that provides basic protection while maximizing mobility, ceramite plate covering vital areas, but leaving limbs relatively unencumbered. This balanced approach reflects Khorne's belief that warriors should be protected enough to reach their enemies, but not so insulated that they feel no risk in combat. Shields occupy a contested position within Khornate doctrine. Some champions view them as cowardly implements that prevent the proper exchange of blows, while others see them as honorable tools that allow warriors to weather initial attacks before responding with their own. This disagreement has spawned distinct combat styles among Khorne's followers, with some warbands emphasizing two-handed weapons, while others develop shield fighting techniques designed to create openings for killing blows. The ultimate expression of Khorne's martial ethos appears in his demonic servants, particularly the bloodthirsters. Each of these greater demons embodies a specific aspect of warfare, from the raw fury of frontline combat to the tactical genius of battlefield command. Their physical forms reflect their specializations, with variations in weaponry, armor, and even body structure depending on their intended function. This specialization demonstrates that Khorne values not just mindless violence, but all aspects of martial prowess, including strategy, discipline, and specialized combat roles. The blood legions of Khorne march across the warp in perfect, brutal formations that would impress even the most disciplined imperial tacticians. Unlike the chaotic hordes of Nurgle or the bizarre, ever-changing ranks of Tzeentch's forces, Khorne's demonic armies display a martial precision that reflects their master's straightforward approach to warfare. They advance in tiered battle lines, organized by both function and status, with each type of demon fulfilling a specific combat role. At the foundation of Khorne's armies stand the Bloodletters, his most numerous demonic servants. Standing roughly the height of an unaugmented human, but with significantly greater muscle mass, these crimson-skinned demons embody the killing stroke itself. Their elongated heads feature jutting jaws filled with needle-sharp teeth, while their eyes burn with the concentrated hatred of 1,000 battlefields. Each Bloodletter carries a Hellblade, a sword formed from solidified warp energy that ignores conventional armor and drinks the soul stuff of those it slays. Bloodletters organize themselves into formations called slaughter packs, typically numbering 8 to 88 individuals, depending on the scale of the conflict. Each pack operates under the command of a blood champion, a veteran bloodletter distinguished by more elaborate horns and additional battle trophies adorning its form. These champions lead primarily by example, being the first to engage enemy forces and the last to withdraw if circumstances require tactical repositioning. The fighting style of bloodletters combines surprising discipline with explosive violence. They advance in tight formations, shields interlocked and hellblades raised, until reaching optimal charging distance. At a signal from their blood champion, typically a guttural battle cry that causes blood vessels to rupture in mortal ears, the formation breaks into a full sprint, each demon selecting a target and focusing exclusively on its destruction. This combination of ordered approach and individualized attack makes bloodletter formations particularly difficult to counter, as they maintain cohesion until the precise moment when discipline gives way to slaughter. Serving as the scouts and hunters of Khorne's legions, flesh hounds represent a different aspect of the blood god's martial philosophy. These quadrupedal demons resemble massive war dogs or hunting beasts, their muscular bodies covered in scales rather than fur, with brass collars inscribed with runes of binding around their thick necks. Standing as tall as a space marine at the shoulder, flesh hounds combine incredible speed with preternatural tracking abilities, allowing them to run down fleeing enemies across impossible distances. The most distinctive feature of flesh hounds is their ability to sense fear and cowardice. The brass collars they wear, known as the collars of Khorne, enhance this natural ability while simultaneously providing protection against psychic attacks. This combination makes flesh hounds particularly effective against enemy psykers, who often rely on warp-based defenses that prove useless against these specialized hunters. Inquisitorial records document cases where flesh hounds have tracked specific targets across entire star systems, following the psychic scent of their fear through warp jumps and planetary transfers. Flesh hounds typically operate in packs of 8, led by the largest and most scarred member, who earns the position through dominance displays rather than formal appointment. These packs fulfill multiple battlefield roles, flanking enemy formations, running down retreating forces, and eliminating high-value targets identified by Khorne's champions. Their hunting patterns show disturbing intelligence, with documented cases of flesh hounds deliberately herding fleeing enemies toward waiting bloodletter formations or cutting off escape routes to force confrontations. The massive juggernauts serve as living battering rams within Khorne's armies, their brass-plated bodies standing taller than a dreadnought. Created from a fusion of demon and machine, these quadrupedal beasts feature mechanical components that seamlessly merge with demonic flesh, creating entities that embody the unstoppable momentum of a battlefield charge. Their heads consist primarily of a massive brass battering ram flanked by gore-encrusted horns, designed to shatter fortifications and crush opposition through pure physical impact. Juggernauts rarely operate independently, instead serving as mounts for Khorne's most favored mortal champions or particularly distinguished bloodletters. The process of binding a juggernaut to a rider involves complex rituals where both entities shed blood into a communal pool, creating a bond that lasts until one or both are destroyed. Once bonded, rider and mount develop an almost telepathic connection, allowing for combat maneuvers that would be impossible for conventional cavalry. The psychological impact of a juggernaut charge often proves as devastating as its physical effects. The thunderous impact of their brass hooves against the ground creates seismic tremors that can be felt hundreds of meters away, while the mechanical components of their bodies emit a grinding roar that overwhelms vox casters and disrupts communication networks. Imperial defensive protocols specifically address juggernaut threats, recommending concentrated heavy weapons fire rather than attempting to withstand their charge with conventional barricades. Skulltakers represent a more specialized class of Khorne's demons, embodying the blood god's appreciation for martial skill over mere brutality. Physically resembling larger, more refined bloodletters, these demons move with the practiced precision of master duelists, rather than the direct aggression of their lesser kin. Each Skulltaker carries a hellblade that has drunk the soul stuff of thousands of worthy opponents, the weapons themselves becoming repositories of combat knowledge accumulated across millennia of warfare. Unlike most of Khorne's servants who engage enemies en masse, Skulltakers actively seek out enemy champions for individual combat. They issue formal challenges according to ancient protocols that transcend language barriers, communicating their intent through elaborate weapon displays that even Xeno species instinctively recognize as calls to single combat. Those who accept these challenges face opponents who have perfected their swordsmanship through countless duels against the finest warriors the galaxy has produced. The most infamous of all Skulltakers, Azul, serves as Khorne's personal executioner and collector of worthy skulls. Distinguished by his ancient brass armor and the crown of skulls that hovers above his horned head, Azul has claimed the heads of Space Marine Chapter Masters, Ildari Exarchs, and even a Primarch according to certain forbidden texts. His presence on a battlefield represents Khorne's direct interest in the conflict, typically appearing only when potential opponents of exceptional skill have drawn the Blood God's attention. Blood Thrones serve as mobile command platforms within Khorne's legions, combining the functions of transport, weapons platform, and symbolic representation of the Blood God's authority. These massive constructs resemble smaller versions of Khorne's own skull throne, mounted atop churning mechanical treads that crush anything in their path. From these elevated positions, heralds of Khorne, specialized demons who speak with the Blood God's authority, direct the movements of lesser formations while participating directly in combat through warp-fueled brass weaponry mounted on the throne itself. The presence of a blood throne on the battlefield significantly enhances the combat effectiveness of nearby bloodletters, who fight with increased ferocity in the presence of such a direct manifestation of their master's power. The heralds who command these platforms use a combination of telepathic commands and physical signals to coordinate complex battlefield maneuvers, demonstrating that Khorne's forces possess far greater tactical sophistication than Imperial propaganda suggests. At the apex of Khorne's demonic hierarchy stand the mighty bloodthirsters, greater demons who embody specific aspects of warfare and violence. Standing 3 to 5 times the height of a space marine, these winged entities combine the worst aspects of predatory beasts with the tactical intelligence of veteran commanders. Their bodies feature the muscular torso and arms of idealized warriors atop powerful goat-like legs, with massive leathery wings that allow for surprising aerial mobility despite their enormous size. Each bloodthirster carries weapons sized appropriately to their massive frames, typically a massive axe in one hand and a barbed whip or secondary weapon in the other. The hierarchy of bloodthirsters follows a strict ordering based on combat specialization and favor with Khorne. The most common variant, the Bloodthirsters of Unfettered Fury, serve as front-line commanders leading from the vanguard of Khorne's armies. Their fighting style emphasizes overwhelming aggression and personal combat prowess, inspiring lesser demons through examples of spectacular violence. These Bloodthirsters typically carry traditional weapons, a massive axe paired with a lash of Khorne that can strip flesh from bone with a single crack. Bloodthirsters of Insensate Rage represent a more specialized combat function, focusing exclusively on raw destructive potential rather than tactical leadership. Larger and more physically imposing than their Unfettered Fury counterparts, these demons wield massive two-handed axes that can cleave through tank armor or fortification walls with equal ease. They serve as living siege weapons within Khorne's armies, tasked with breaching enemy defenses and creating openings for lesser demons to exploit. The rarest and most tactically sophisticated variant, Bloodthirsters of Wrath and Glory, combine martial prowess with strategic genius. These demons stand slightly smaller than other Bloodthirsters, but move with greater precision and purpose. They typically wield ornate axes inscribed with brass runes that flare with warp fire during combat, paired with barbed whips that can entangle enemies or strip away protective wards. From elevated positions behind the main battle line, these Bloodthirsters coordinate complex maneuvers involving multiple demon types, demonstrating a level of strategic acumen that rivals accomplished mortal generals. Above all these variants stand the 8, Khorne's mightiest demonic servants, each commanding one of the blood legions that form the core of his military power. Each of these supreme bloodthirsters embodies a specific aspect of Khorne's martial philosophy, their physical forms and combat styles reflecting their specialized functions within the blood god's eternal warfare. Among the 8, Angrath the Unbound stands as perhaps the most infamous, known to imperial forces through multiple devastating manifestations across the millennia. As Khorne's chosen bloodthirster, Angrath combines the raw destructive potential of the insensate rage variant with the tactical acumen of wrath and glory, creating a nearly unstoppable combat presence. His most notable manifestation occurred during the Vrax campaign, where his arrival shifted the entire course of the conflict and required the intervention of Grey Knight's Terminators to banish back to the warp. Skarbrand the Exiled occupies a unique position among the 8, simultaneously one of Khorne's most powerful servants and a cautionary example of the blood god's unforgiving nature. Once Khorne's most favored bloodthirster, Skarbrand attempted to strike his master during a moment of rage-induced madness. For this transgression, Khorne stripped him of intelligence and personality while enhancing his already formidable combat abilities, creating a being of pure destructive potential with no capacity for subtlety or restraint. Skarbrand's presence on a battlefield affects both enemy and allied forces, as his aura of uncontrolled rage inflames violent impulses in all nearby entities. Imperial forces facing this bloodthirster have documented cases where disciplined troops abandon defensive positions to charge enemy lines, overcome by artificially induced bloodlust. Even other demons of Khorne maintain distance from Skarbrand when possible, recognizing that his indiscriminate fury makes him as dangerous to allies as to enemies. Kabandha, the third of the 8 to regularly manifest in real space, bears a particular hatred for the Blood Angels Space Marine chapter dating back to the Horus Heresy. During the defense of Terra, Kabandha engaged in personal combat with Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels, creating a blood feud that has persisted for 10,000 years. This bloodthirster specializes in psychological warfare alongside physical violence, deliberately targeting Blood Angels' forces whenever possible and employing tactics designed to trigger their genetic predisposition toward the Black Rage. The Blood Legions commanded by the 8 operate as distinct military formations with specialized combat functions. The First Legion, led by Angrath, serves as Khorne's primary battlefield force, deploying in full regimental strength with balanced compositions of all demon types. The Second Legion under Kabandha specializes in targeted strikes against specific enemies who have earned Khorne's particular enmity, often operating in smaller, more focused deployments. The 3rd through 7th Legions each maintain distinct combat specializations, from siege warfare to rapid assault to hunter-killer operations. The 8th Legion, commanded by Skarbrand, operates unlike the others, less a coordinated military force and more a gathering of Khorne's most uncontrollable servants. This legion deploys only in circumstances where maximum destruction takes priority over tactical considerations, functioning essentially as a weapon of last resort within the blood god's arsenal. The rare occasions when all 8 legions deploy simultaneously typically coincide with major warp storms or temporary weakening of the barriers between real space and the immaterium. The eternal warfare between Khorne's legions and the forces of rival chaos gods forms a central component of the Great Game, the ongoing struggle for dominance within the realm of chaos. These conflicts follow patterns incomprehensible to mortal minds, with front lines shifting based on emotional currents flowing through the warp rather than conventional geography. Territory gained or lost corresponds directly to shifts in the emotional state of mortal civilizations, with increases in specific emotions strengthening the corresponding chaos god's position. Khorne's legions maintain particularly active fronts against the forces of Slaanesh and Tzeentch, with whom the blood god shares fundamental philosophical differences. Against Slaanesh's sensuous legions, Khorne's demons employ direct, overwhelming force to counter their opponent's speed and grace. These battles typically feature massive frontal assaults by bloodletter formations supported by juggernaut cavalry, attempting to overwhelm the more individually skilled but less durable Slaaneshi demons through sheer weight of numbers and martial discipline. Against Tzeentch's forces, Khorne's legions adopt more specialized tactics centered around their natural resistance to psychic warfare. Flesh hounds with their collars of Khorne form the vanguard of these assaults, their anti-psychic properties allowing them to close with Tzeentch's sorceress demons despite arcane barriers and warp-based defenses. Behind these specialized hunters come waves of bloodletters whose hellblades can disrupt the complex patterns of change that Tzeentch's demons use to maintain their forms. The transformation of Khorne from respected captain of the World Eaters to the infamous betrayer stands as perhaps the most complete example of Khorne's influence upon a mortal champion. Before the Horus Heresy, Khorne served as captain of the 8th Assault Company and equerry to Primarch Angron, already distinguished by his martial prowess, but still bound by the discipline and brotherhood of the Legion's Astartes. Imperial historical records indicate that Khorne initially served as a voice of reason within the increasingly unstable World Eaters, attempting to mediate between his Primarch's rage and the Legion's need for tactical coherence. The pivotal transformation began during the Horus Heresy, specifically following the events at Istvan III, where Khorne sustained near-fatal injuries while fighting loyalist forces. During his recovery, the first whispers of Khorne reached him through the pain of his wounds and the psycho-surgery of the Butcher's Nails implants. Unlike many who fall to chaos through grand rituals or conscious bargains, Khorne's dedication to Khorne developed organically through his experiences of battle and bloodshed. The Shadow Crusade alongside the Word-Bearers accelerated Khorne's transformation. As the World Eaters descended further into uncontrolled butchery, Khorne distinguished himself not through mindless violence, but through his ability to maintain combat effectiveness despite the growing influence of the Butcher's Nails. While other World Eaters became little more than frenzied berserkers, Khorne developed a cold, calculated approach to violence that caught Khorne's attention far more effectively than simple bloodlust. By the Siege of Terra, Khorne had received subtle blessings from the Blood God, enhanced strength, unnatural combat reflexes, and a preternatural ability to identify opponents' weaknesses. These gifts manifested not as obvious mutations, but as improvements to his already formidable combat abilities. Survivors from the Imperial Palace defenses described Khorne moving with impossible speed, his chain axe Gorchald striking with precision that belied the weapon's brutal design. The true birth of the Betrayer occurred not during the Heresy but afterward, during the Legion Wars within the Eye of Terror. At the Battle of Scalathrax, when Emperor's children and World Eaters fought amid plummeting temperatures, Khorne's actions earned him his infamous title. As other warriors sought shelter from the killing cold, Khorne raged against what he perceived as cowardice, turning his chain axe against his own Legion brothers and burning their shelters. This act of betrayal perfectly embodied Khorne's ethos: blood must flow, regardless of its source. In the millennia since Scalathrax, Khorne has evolved into something beyond a mere chaos space marine. Neither fully mortal nor demon, he exists as a living conduit for Khorne's influence in the material realm. His body has remained largely intact, rather than suffering the grotesque mutations common to other Chaos champions, another sign of Khorne's favor, as the Blood God appreciates the purity of Khorne's dedication to violence without need for physical transformation. The relationship between Khorne and Khorne differs from typical patron-servant dynamics among Chaos entities. Where most champions eventually seek demonhood as their ultimate reward, Khorne appears content with his role as a mortal killer. This arrangement benefits both parties. Khorne receives an unparalleled harvester of skulls who operates freely in real space without the limitations that bind demons, while Khorne enjoys continuous battle without the constraints of mortality. Khorne's combat style exemplifies Khorne's martial philosophy. He eschews ranged weapons almost entirely, relying on his plasma pistol only to close distance with enemies before engaging with Gorchald. In melee combat, he displays none of the theatrical flourishes common to champions of other Chaos gods, instead employing brutally efficient strikes designed to maximize blood spilled per second. Imperial combat analysts note that despite his berserker reputation, Khorne fights with disturbing precision, targeting vital areas and moving with economy of motion that indicates tactical awareness beneath his rage. While Khorne stands as Khorne's most famous champion, the Blood God maintains a diverse pantheon of mortal servants across the galaxy. The Blood Pact represents one of the most organized and militarily effective Khornate cults, distinguished from typical Chaos warbands by their discipline and tactical sophistication. Founded by the Chaos Lord Urlach Gower in the Sabbat worlds, the Blood Pact evolved from a standard Chaos cult into something resembling a dark reflection of the Imperial Guard, with standardized equipment, rank structures, and battlefield tactics. Blood Pact warriors undergo initiation rituals that bind them not just spiritually, but physically to their dark patron. Each member bears the Blood Pact itself, a palm sliced open and pressed against the superheated metal of their uniform's chest plate, creating a permanent scar that marks them as Khorne's property. This ritual serves practical purposes beyond symbolism, creating a psychic link between cult members that enhances unit cohesion and allows for coordinated maneuvers even when conventional communication fails. Unlike many Khornate warbands that rely solely on close combat shock tactics, the Blood Pact employs combined arms approaches including artillery, armor, and specialized infantry formations. Their signature units, the Locksaddle mercenary packs and Sons of Sek elite formations, demonstrate tactical flexibility rarely seen among Chaos forces. This sophistication stems from the Blood Pact's origins. Unlike cults formed from corrupted space marines or primitive tribal warriors, they developed from experienced human soldiers who brought their military knowledge into Khorne's service. The Blood Pact's effectiveness comes partially from their understanding that Khorne values blood spilled efficiently, not just abundantly. Their operations typically target military installations rather than civilian populations, focusing on opponents who can provide worthy resistance. When they do attack civilian targets, the purpose remains strategic, creating panic that draws military forces into disadvantageous engagements where more blood can be harvested from trained warriors. In stark contrast to the disciplined Blood Pact, the Skulltakers represent Khorne's more traditional approach to mortal worship. These disparate warbands operate independently across the galaxy, each led by a champion who has caught the Blood God's attention through particularly impressive acts of violence. Unlike the standardized appearance of the Blood Pact, Skulltakers display considerable variation in armor, weapons, and tactical approaches, unified only by their dedication to collecting worthy skulls for their patron. The Skulltakers follow a loose hierarchy determined entirely by combat prowess. New members typically join after surviving an encounter with existing cult members, either by demonstrating sufficient skill to earn respect or by defeating a current member and taking their place. This continuous process of violent selection ensures that only the most capable warriors rise through the ranks, creating warbands of exceptional lethality, even by the standards of Chaos forces. Rituals among the Skulltakers focus almost exclusively on combat preparation and skull collection. Before major engagements, warriors engage in ceremonial duels that serve both as offerings to Khorne and as practical combat training. These duels typically continue until first blood rather than death, preserving the warband's strength while still providing the Blood God with his tithe. After battles, elaborate rituals govern the collection and preparation of skulls, with specific procedures for cleaning, preserving, and displaying trophies based on the worthiness of the opponent. The transformation from ordinary mortal to Khornate champion follows a progression marked by increasingly severe blood rituals. The initial dedication typically occurs during combat, when a warrior facing death or defeat makes a desperate plea for strength. Unlike the complex incantations required by Tzeentch or the elaborate sensory rituals of Slaanesh, Khorne requires only blood willingly spilled and a sincere commitment to continued violence. This accessibility explains the prevalence of Khorne worship among frontline troops in primitive cultures. The barriers to entry remain minimal compared to other Chaos paths. For those who survive their initial dedication, the next stage involves deliberate blood sacrifice to strengthen the connection with Khorne. These rituals typically begin with personal bloodletting, warriors opening their own veins to demonstrate commitment before progressing to the sacrifice of captured enemies. The quality of sacrifices directly affects the blessings received, with worthy opponents providing more significant enhancements than helpless victims. This creates a practical incentive for Khorne's followers to seek out powerful enemies rather than easy targets. As a warrior progresses further into Khorne's service, physical changes begin to manifest. Unlike the random mutations common to undivided chaos followers, these changes follow predictable patterns aligned with combat effectiveness. Musculature densifies to provide greater striking power, reaction times improve beyond natural limits, and bone structure reinforces to withstand greater physical stress. These enhancements initially remain subtle enough to pass for natural variation or extensive training, allowing Khorne's early-stage followers to operate undetected within Imperial organizations. More advanced transformation brings obvious physical changes that mark the warrior irrevocably as Khorne's property. Skin reddens and hardens into a substance resembling ceramite, providing natural armor comparable to light military protection. Teeth sharpen and elongate into tusks or fangs suitable for tearing flesh in close combat. Most significantly, the skull begins to reshape, often developing horn-like protrusions that echo the appearance of Khorne's demonic servants. These changes typically coincide with psychological transformation, increased aggression, diminished impulse control, and growing obsession with blood and skulls. The final stages of mortal transformation culminate in ascension to the rank of Chaos Lord, or, for the truly exceptional, demonhood. Chaos Lords dedicated to Khorne undergo extensive physical and psychological modification while remaining fundamentally mortal. Their bodies become living weapons, enhanced beyond even Space Marine capabilities, while their minds narrow to laser-focused instruments of war. These individuals retain enough tactical acumen and leadership ability to command warbands effectively while embodying Khorne's martial virtues completely. The psychological profile of those drawn to Khorne's worship reveals patterns distinct from followers of other chaos gods. Where Tzeentch appeals to the ambitious and intellectually curious, Slaanesh to the sensation-seeking and perfectionist, and Nurgle to the despairing and resilient, Khorne attracts individuals with specific psychological characteristics predisposed to his particular brand of worship. The most common entry point comes through combat trauma and battlefield stress. Frontline soldiers who experience prolonged exposure to violence often develop psychological adaptations that align naturally with Khorne's ethos. The need to dehumanize enemies, the adrenaline dependency that develops from repeated combat, and the emotional numbing necessary for survival all create psychological conditions receptive to Khorne's influence. Imperial Guard veterans from high-intensity conflict zones show particularly high vulnerability to Khornate corruption, especially those from regiments with strong warrior cultures that already valorize combat prowess. Individuals with pre-existing impulse control disorders represent another high-risk population for Khorne worship. Those who struggle to manage aggressive impulses in normal society may find Khorne's philosophy liberating, a context where their natural tendencies become virtues rather than liabilities. Underhive gangers, frontier world settlers from violent backgrounds, and even disgraced nobility with histories of dueling all fall into this category. For these individuals, Khorne offers not just supernatural power, but social validation of their pre-existing behavioral patterns. Perhaps most concerning to Imperial authorities, military leadership figures sometimes gravitate toward Khorne through a corrupted sense of martial honor. Career officers who become disillusioned with Imperial bureaucracy or political interference in military matters may see Khorne's straightforward approach to warfare as a purer alternative to the compromise-laden reality of Imperial command. These individuals typically begin their fall through seemingly reasonable objections to dishonorable tactics or wasteful strategies before gradually embracing more extreme interpretations of martial virtue. The path from initial interest to full Chaos Lord status typically spans years or decades, with distinct psychological stages marking the progression. The early phase often features rationalization, with the individual maintaining that they remain loyal to their original cause while simply adopting more effective, or honest, approaches to combat. This self-deception allows the corruption to take root without triggering the subject's moral objections or alerting colleagues to the change. As corruption advances, the middle phase brings increasing isolation from non-combatants and fixation on martial identity. Warriors in this stage begin separating themselves from civilians and support personnel, viewing only fellow fighters as worthy of respect or consideration. Their self-image becomes entirely defined by combat prowess, with other aspects of personality gradually atrophying through neglect. Personal relationships outside the context of warfare weaken or disappear entirely, replaced by battle bonds with fellow warriors based solely on shared violence. The final psychological stage before full corruption involves the normalization of atrocity and development of blood ritual behaviors. Actions that would have seemed unthinkable in earlier life, trophy taking from enemies, ritualized combat challenges, blood consumption, become routine aspects of the warrior's existence. Significantly, the individual typically perceives these behaviors not as moral deterioration, but as evolution toward a more honest or pure approach to warfare, free from what they now view as the hypocritical constraints of conventional military ethics. The completed Khorne champion emerges from this process as a being psychologically distinct from their original self, yet maintaining a twisted continuity with their former identity. Unlike followers of Tzeentch who might become unrecognizable through radical transformation, or Nurgle's disciples who surrender to passive acceptance, Khorne's champions typically view themselves as perfected versions of their original selves, warriors who have stripped away societal constraints to embrace their true nature as killers. The transformation of the 12th Legion from the Emperor's warriors into Khorne's devoted servants represents one of the most complete corruptions in Astartes' history. Originally known as the Warhounds, the Legion established a reputation for effectiveness and brutal efficiency even before being reunited with their Primarch. Early Imperial records describe them as reliable and ferocious when unleashed, traits that would later make them perfect vessels for Khorne's influence. The Warhounds recruited primarily from the harsh prison worlds of Old Terra, selecting for aggression and resilience among the criminal populations. This recruitment pattern established the Legion's character early. They were blunt instruments rather than subtle weapons, designed to achieve compliance through overwhelming force rather than diplomatic finesse. Despite this brutality, Imperial records indicate the pre-Angron Warhounds maintained strict discipline and tactical cohesion, with their violence carefully directed and controlled. The Legion's fate changed forever when they were united with their Primarch Angron, discovered on the world of Nuceria. Unlike most Primarchs who rose to positions of leadership on their adoptive worlds, Angron lived as a slave gladiator, implanted with archaeotech devices known as the Butcher's Nails that amplified aggression while suppressing higher brain functions. When the Emperor arrived to claim his son, Angron refused to leave his fellow gladiators who were making a last stand against their oppressors. Rather than assist in their fight or allow Angron his death alongside his comrades, the Emperor teleported Angron away against his will, saving his Primarch, but leaving Angron's adopted brothers and sisters to die without him. This abandonment created a wound in Angron's psyche that would never heal. Unlike other Primarchs who viewed their legions as sons or brothers, Angron saw his inherited Astartes as poor replacements for the gladiator family he had lost. He renamed them the World Eaters, a bitter reference to their role as devourers of worlds in the Emperor's name, and immediately began reshaping them in the image of Nucerian gladiators. The first and most devastating change came with Angron's insistence that his sons undergo the same neural surgery he had endured. The Butcher's Nails implants were crude compared to the sophisticated technology used in Astartes' creation, and their implementation proved immediately problematic. Unlike Angron, whose Primarch physiology could partially compensate for the damage, ordinary Space Marines suffered severe neurological side effects. Many died during implantation, while others lost cognitive function or developed uncontrollable rage episodes that made them liabilities in complex operations. Despite these obvious problems, Angron demanded the practice continue. Legion apothecaries attempted to refine the procedure, creating modified implants that mimicked the effects of Angron's original nails while reducing mortality rates. These efforts achieved limited success, death rates decreased, but the fundamental impact remained unchanged. The nails rewired the brain to experience pleasure only during moments of extreme violence and aggression, while suppressing all other positive emotions. The cultural transformation of the Legion happened alongside these physiological changes. Angron organized his companies into gladiatorial cadres, forcing them to engage in lethal combat practices between missions. Traditional Astartes training emphasized teamwork and unit cohesion, but Angron's methods promoted individual combat prowess and personal glory. Brotherhood within the Legion fractured as Marines increasingly viewed each other as competitors rather than comrades. Captain Khorne, who would later become Khorne's most infamous champion, initially resisted these changes. Imperial records indicate he attempted to preserve elements of the old Warhound's culture, emphasizing discipline and tactical effectiveness over blind rage. For a time, he served as a moderating influence on Angron, translating the Primarch's often incoherent commands into actionable battle plans. This role earned him the position of equerry, though it also placed him directly in the path of Angron's frequent wrath. The Legion's descent accelerated after the Genna massacre, where the World Eaters exterminated an entire planetary population rather than spend time bringing it to compliance. This atrocity led to a rare formal censure from the Emperor himself, with Malcador the Sigillite delivering the rebuke personally. Rather than accepting this criticism, Angron and his Legion grew more resentful of imperial authority, seeing the censure as hypocrisy from leaders who conquered the galaxy while pretending moral superiority. By the time Horus began his rebellion, the World Eaters were primed for corruption. Their neural implants created constant pain that could only be relieved through violence. Their Legion culture valued personal prowess over loyalty or duty, and their Primarch carried a deep-seated resentment toward the Emperor. When Horus offered Angron autonomy and unlimited opportunities for bloodshed, the decision to join the rebellion required little deliberation. The Horus heresy provided the perfect conditions for Khorne's influence to take root within the Legion. As the conflict intensified, the World Eaters found themselves engaged in increasingly desperate and brutal combat against their former brothers. The neural implants that had previously been controlled through discipline and training now received full expression, with Angron encouraging his sons to embrace the rage rather than contain it. The Shadow Crusade alongside Lorgar's word-bearers marked a crucial turning point. As the two traitor legions cut a path of destruction through Ultramar, the word-bearers, already devoted to chaos, performed rituals that exposed the World Eaters to warp influences. While Angron's warriors didn't consciously worship chaos at this stage, their actions, the excessive bloodshed, the taking of skulls as trophies, the emphasis on close combat over ranged warfare, aligned perfectly with Khorne's ethos. Lorgar, recognizing that Angron was slowly dying from the neural damage caused by his implants, orchestrated a ritual on the planet Nuceria that would transform the World Eater's Primarch into a demon prince of Khorne. This apotheosis completed Angron's fall and cemented the Legion's alignment with the Blood God. No longer simply rebellious space marines, they now served as conduits for Khorne's influence in the material realm. By the Siege of Terra, the World Eaters had abandoned most pretenses of strategic warfare. They launched themselves at the Imperial Palace defenses in wave after wave of berserker assaults, concerned more with the glory of close combat than with actually securing objectives. This behavior perfectly exemplified Khorne's martial philosophy, valuing the act of bloodshed itself over the strategic outcomes it might achieve. The post-heresy period saw the World Eaters fragment as a coherent legion. Without the unifying purpose of overthrowing the Emperor, the inherent instability of their butcher's nails implants led to increasing infighting. This process culminated at the Battle of Scalathrax, where the Legion effectively destroyed itself as an organized force when Khorne, by then fully in Khorne's grip, turned against his battle brothers for seeking shelter from the extreme cold rather than continuing to fight. After Scalathrax, the World Eaters devolved into independent warbands of varying sizes, each led by a champion seeking Khorne's favor through acts of spectacular violence. This fragmentation, rather than weakening Khorne's influence, actually spread it more effectively across the galaxy. Instead of operating as a single force with defined objectives, World Eaters' warbands appeared unpredictably across dozens of sectors, making them nearly impossible to counter systematically. The largest of these post-Scalathrax formations, the Berserkers of Scalathrax, coalesced around veterans who survived Khorne's betrayal but embraced his philosophy of uncompromising bloodshed. Unlike many Chaos warbands that develop complex internal hierarchies, the Berserkers maintain a brutally simple organization. The strongest lead until someone stronger defeats them. Combat prowess serves as the only recognized currency within their ranks, with elaborate kill markings on armor indicating a warrior's status. The Berserkers' combat doctrine emphasizes close-quarters shock assaults, typically delivered via drop pods or assault boats that place them directly into enemy formations. They eschew heavy support weapons almost entirely, preferring chain axes, power weapons, and other implements that maximize blood spilled per engagement. Their effectiveness comes not from tactical sophistication, but from the sheer violence of their assaults. Imperial defenders facing Berserkers must contend not only with enhanced Astartes physiology, but with warriors who feel no pain and will continue fighting despite injuries that would incapacitate even normal space marines. The Skulltakers represent another significant post-Legion formation, distinguished by their ritualistic approach to Khorne worship. Where the Berserkers embody pure combat fury, the Skulltakers maintain elements of the old Legion's discipline, channeling their aggression into carefully structured blood rituals. Each warrior belongs to a skull circle of 8, with members competing to collect the most worthy trophies while supporting each other in battle. The Skulltakers place particular emphasis on targeting enemy champions and leaders, believing that such high-value skulls curry greater favor with Khorne. This targeting priority makes them especially dangerous to Imperial command structures, as they will bypass tactically significant objectives to reach officers or special forces. Inquisitorial tactical advisories specifically warn commanders facing Skulltakers to maintain lower profiles in battle and to avoid distinctive wargear that might mark them as priority targets. While most World Eaters warbands operate independently, they occasionally coalesce into larger formations when a sufficiently charismatic or powerful champion emerges. These temporary alliances typically form around specific campaigns, offering exceptional opportunities for bloodshed, such as Black Crusades or major Imperial conflicts where resources are already committed. The warbands maintain their individual identities within these larger structures, cooperating just enough to maximize killing efficiency before inevitably turning on each other once external enemies are eliminated. The physiological and psychological state of modern World Eaters represents the endpoint of a 10,000-year devolution. The Butcher's Nails implants, originally crude but functional, have been modified and enhanced through a combination of chaos influence and dark technology. Current iterations merge seamlessly with both the recipient's nervous system and the warp itself, creating a direct connection between the warrior's rage and Khorne's domain. This connection manifests physically during combat, with the most affected warriors literally bleeding warp energy from their eyes and mouths as they fight. The neural damage caused by these enhanced implants renders most World Eaters incapable of complex reasoning outside of combat situations. They exist in a state of constant pain and sensory deprivation, experiencing pleasure only during moments of extreme violence. Between battles, they typically enter suspended animation states similar to catatonia, conserving energy until new opportunities for bloodshed present themselves. This condition makes them highly dependent on mortal followers or less affected champions who can handle logistics, transportation, and target selection. Despite this degraded mental state, World Eaters retain preternatural combat instincts and tactical awareness once engaged with the enemy. The same neural rewiring that destroys higher cognitive functions enhances reaction times and aggression, creating warriors who respond to battlefield conditions with predatory efficiency. This combination of mindless fury and combat intuition makes them unpredictable opponents. They lack the strategic sophistication of legions like the Alpha Legion or Black Legion, but compensate with sheer ferocity and battlefield adaptability. The equipment and appearance of World Eaters warbands reflects their single-minded dedication to close combat. Their power armor, originally the white and blue of the Old Legion, now typically appears in Khorne's colors, brass, black, and blood red. Many warriors modify their helmets to resemble screaming faces or snarling beasts, while others abandon helmets entirely to better experience the sensory rush of direct combat. Armor panels often bear trophy racks displaying skulls or flayed skin from particularly worthy opponents. The Axe of Khorne stands as perhaps the most iconic weapon in the Blood God's arsenal, a manifestation of his martial philosophy rendered in physical form. Unlike the Staff of Tzeentch or the Scythe of Nurgle, the axe exists in multiple iterations simultaneously, with each manifestation sharing the same essential nature while adapting to its wielder's specific combat style. The weapon's basic form remains consistent across all versions, a massive double-headed axe with a brass-forged blade that continuously exudes blood from microscopic pores in the metal. The weapon's haft typically consists of blackened iron, wrapped in leather made from the flayed skin of particularly worthy opponents. When wielded by a bloodthirster, the axe grows to match the greater demon's enormous proportions, sometimes reaching the size of a rhino transport. In these manifestations, the weapon's blade often bears inscriptions in the dark tongue that shift and change during combat, displaying the names of those it has slain or will slay in the immediate future. The blood that flows from the blade in these larger manifestations burns with warp fire, igniting anything it touches with unquenchable flames that consume both flesh and soul simultaneously. For mortal champions, the axe manifests in more manageable proportions, though still larger than conventional weapons of its type. These versions typically bond permanently with their wielders, the weapon's haft fusing with the champion's armor or even merging directly with their flesh in cases of particular favor. Once bonded, the axe cannot be disarmed or separated from its owner except through their death, at which point it either disappears back to the brass citadel or transfers immediately to a worthy successor on the battlefield. The supernatural properties of the axe extend far beyond its physical characteristics. The weapon acts as a conduit for Khorne's consciousness, allowing him limited awareness of events transpiring around his champions. This connection manifests most noticeably in the weapon's thirst for worthy opponents. Many bearers report feeling the axe physically pull toward powerful enemies, guiding them toward the most challenging combat available. This targeting function proves particularly effective against psykers and sorcerers, whom the axe seems to detect even when concealed or disguised. In combat, the axe demonstrates its true purpose through its interaction with blood and skulls. The blade absorbs a portion of the blood spilled by its strikes, channeling this vidi directly to Khorne's realm, where it joins the rivers surrounding the brass citadel. This absorption creates a disturbing visual effect, where blood splatter from wounds seems to curve unnaturally toward the weapon, rather than spraying naturally. The skulls of those slain by the axe, meanwhile, separate cleanly from the body, regardless of the actual strike location, often with facial features frozen in expressions of terror or revelation. Less common but equally feared is the slaughter sword, a single-edged blade of enormous proportions favored by certain bloodthirsters and particularly martial-minded champions. Unlike the brutal functionality of the axe, the slaughter sword embodies lethal precision, its impossibly sharp edge capable of slicing through ceramite armor as easily as unprotected flesh. The blade's composition defies conventional material analysis, appearing as solid blood that has somehow crystallized into a substance harder than adamantium. The most distinctive feature of the slaughter sword is its ability to learn from those it kills. Each worthy opponent slain by the blade imparts a fraction of their combat knowledge to the weapon, which then transfers these techniques to subsequent wielders. A champion who has carried a slaughter sword for any significant period typically displays fighting styles and maneuvers drawn from dozens of martial traditions across the galaxy, creating a hybrid combat approach impossible to predict or counter effectively. This adaptive quality makes veteran slaughter sword bearers particularly dangerous to specialized fighters like aspect warriors or chapter-specific Space Marine combat experts. The Whip of Khorne completes the traditional weapon trio associated with bloodthirsters, though it occasionally manifests for mortal champions who demonstrate particular skill in multi-weapon combat. The whip consists of serrated brass links connected by strands of warp energy that glow with the same red hue as the rivers surrounding the brass citadel. Unlike conventional whips that cause surface damage, the whip of Khorne lashes at the victim's very soul, causing wounds that cannot be healed by physical means and often continue bleeding long after the initial strike. Beyond its direct damage capabilities, the whip serves primarily as a control weapon, allowing bloodthirsters to capture and restrain particularly valuable opponents. When wrapped around a victim, the whip creates a direct connection to Khorne's domain, subjecting the trapped individual to the pure essence of rage and bloodlust that forms the blood god's consciousness. Few mortals can withstand this exposure for more than moments before their minds shatter from the intensity of emotion, leaving them as hollow vessels filled only with killing intent, effectively creating berserkers who will attack anything within reach once released. For mortal champions unable to wield the direct manifestations of Khorne's signature weapons, countless lesser demonic armaments exist, each with its own unique properties and requirements. Hellblades, the standard weapons carried by bloodletters, occasionally find their way into mortal hands through pacts or as rewards for exceptional service. These swords, forged from solidified warp energy rather than conventional metal, ignore armor saves that rely on physical protection, cutting directly through ceramite or adamantium to reach the flesh beneath. The most distinctive feature of Hellblades is their constant hunger for souls, which manifests as a subtle vibration when near potential victims and escalates to an audible keening when actually striking living targets. This hunger transfers partially to the wielder, creating a psychological compulsion to continue killing that can override even basic self-preservation instincts. Long-term bearers of Hellblades often develop physical symptoms of this bond. Their blood may begin glowing with the same red energy that comprises the blade, or their eyes might emit smoke during periods of combat excitement. Beyond these standardized weapons, countless unique artifacts exist within Khorne's armories, each created for specific champions or particular types of warfare. The Gore Lady, sister axe to Khorne's infamous Gorechild, currently resides with an unknown champion somewhere in the Ghoul Stars, its location a matter of intense interest to both Chaos Warbands seeking its power and Ordo Malleus Inquisitors hoping to contain its influence. The weapon's blade, fashioned from the same rare alloy as its brother axe, maintains its edge at the molecular level, allowing it to slice through virtually any material without dulling. The Skull Reaver, a massive two-handed hammer wielded by the bloodthirster Kajaganath during the First War for Armageddon, contains the bound essences of 1,000 champion psychers defeated by Khorne's forces. These trapped souls emit constant psychic screams that prove particularly devastating to warp-sensitive enemies, causing nearby psychers to experience debilitating migraines or even cerebral hemorrhages. The weapon's physical impact, meanwhile, causes wounds that resist all forms of healing, both conventional and psychic, with injuries continuing to bleed until the victim expires from blood loss. Brass armor represents the standard protection favored by Khorne's mortal champions, its composition and properties setting it apart from both conventional armor systems and the protective gear associated with other chaos powers. Unlike the constantly shifting armor of Tzeentch's followers, or the disease-ridden plate worn by Nurgle's champions, brass armor maintains consistent physical properties while incorporating demonic essences that enhance its protective capabilities beyond material limitations. The creation of brass armor begins with conventional materials, typically ceramite plate salvaged from Loyalist space marine armor or adamantium sheets taken from Imperial war machines. These base components undergo a transformation ritual that lasts 8 days, during which the armor pieces are submerged in the blood of worthy opponents, while Khornate priests recite specific incantations in the Dark Tongue. As the ritual progresses, the original materials gradually transmute into living brass, a substance that maintains the appearance and weight of conventional brass, but demonstrates self-repair capabilities and responsiveness to its wearer's combat needs. The completed armor bonds permanently with its intended wearer through a final ceremony, where the champion's blood mingles with that used in the forging process. Once bonded, the armor responds to its wearer's emotional state, particularly rage and bloodlust. During periods of combat excitement, microscopic barbs extend from the armor's interior, piercing the wearer's skin to create a direct blood connection that enhances strength and reaction time while simultaneously dampening pain reception. This feature explains the berserker combat style associated with many Khornate champions. The armor literally pushes them toward greater aggression through its physical interface with their bodies. The exterior surface of brass armor typically features elaborate engravings depicting the wearer's greatest victories or symbols sacred to Khorne. These decorations serve both ceremonial and practical purposes. The patterns channel warp energy in specific configurations that enhance the armor's resistance to both physical and psychic attacks. The most common motifs include stylized blood drops, skull runes, and interlocking geometric patterns that hurt the eyes of those who look too closely at them. Many champions add personal touches to these standard designs, incorporating trophies from fallen enemies or campaign markings specific to their warband. Unlike power armor that relies on complex mechanical systems and energy fields, brass armor draws its enhancement capabilities directly from the warp through its demonic composition. This connection manifests most noticeably in the armor's response to damage. When struck with sufficient force to breach its protection, the armor bleeds actual blood rather than showing conventional material damage. This bleeding serves as both repair mechanism and offensive capability, as the blood that flows from damaged sections burns like acid when contacting enemy armor or flesh. The Collar of Khorne stands as perhaps the most specialized protective artifact in the Blood God's arsenal, designed specifically to counter the psychic abilities that Khorne finds so dishonorable. In its most common form, the collar appears as a thick band of brass inscribed with anti-clockwise spiraling runes that glow red when in proximity to active psychic powers. These collars range in size from those fitted for mortal champions to the massive versions worn by flesh hounds and juggernauts, with the basic function remaining consistent across all manifestations. The collar's primary purpose is to disrupt and nullify psychic energy directed against its wearer. When subjected to psychic attack, the runes inscribed on the collar's surface absorb the incoming warp energy, converting it into heat that disperses harmlessly into the surrounding environment. This conversion creates a distinctive visual effect where the air around the collar shimmers as if viewed through intense heat haze, while the brass itself glows with increasing brightness depending on the strength of the psychic assault being countered. Beyond this passive protection, more elaborate versions of the collar worn by high-ranking champions include active countermeasures against psychic opponents. These enhanced collars can redirect absorbed energy back toward its source, often with devastating effects as the psyker finds their own power turned against them in unpredictable ways. The most powerful manifestations can even temporarily sever a psyker's connection to the warp entirely, creating a localized null field similar to those generated by the Sisters of Silence, but focused specifically on the targeted individual rather than affecting an area. The creation process for collars involves materials and techniques specifically designed to resist warp influence. The base metal comes from mundane brass that has been ritually purified through exposure to the blood of blanks, individuals with the pariah gene who naturally disrupt psychic energy. This purified brass then undergoes forging in negative temperature conditions, typically achieved by conducting the ritual within the eye of a warp storm where conventional physical laws break down. The resulting material exists partially outside normal reality, allowing it to intercept and disrupt warp energy before it fully manifests in real space. The psychological impact of facing an opponent wearing a collar of Khorne proves particularly devastating to psykers, who suddenly find themselves deprived of their primary combat advantage. Imperial training protocols for sanctioned psykers specifically address this threat, recommending immediate disengagement and range support roles when collars are identified on the battlefield. Even with this preparation, the sight of a collar often induces panic reactions in warp-sensitive individuals, who instinctively recognize the existential threat these artifacts pose to their abilities and potentially their lives. Among the lesser-known but equally potent artifacts in Khorne's arsenal, the Crimson Crown deserves particular attention for its unique role in enhancing not individual champions, but entire warbands. Unlike personal weapons or armor, the crown serves as a focal point for group worship and combat coordination, typically held by a warband's leader, but providing benefits to all warriors fighting in its proximity. Physically, the crown appears as a circlet of brass inset with 8 blood-red gemstones, each containing the essence of a bloodletter, bound in service to the artifact. When activated through ritual bloodletting before battle, the crown establishes a primitive form of combat network among nearby Khornate warriors, allowing for coordination that transcends the need for verbal or visual communication. This network operates on an emotional rather than intellectual level, transmitting battle rage and targeting priorities rather than complex tactical instructions. The practical effect resembles a wolf pack hunting pattern, with warriors instinctively focusing on the same targets and supporting each other's attacks without conscious planning. The crown's influence extends beyond simple coordination to actively enhance the combat capabilities of those fighting within its sphere of influence. Warriors report experiencing accelerated perception of time during critical combat moments, allowing them to react to threats with preternatural speed. Wounds that would normally prove debilitating seem to close partially or cause less pain, permitting continued fighting despite significant damage. Perhaps most significantly, the crown amplifies the natural battle rage of Khorne's followers, pushing them toward the perfect balance between berserk fury and tactical awareness that characterizes the most effective Khornate champions. The 8 Pillars of Doom represent Khorne's most architectural artifacts, massive brass columns that can be summoned to real space through elaborate blood rituals, typically requiring the sacrifice of exactly 888 victims. When successfully manifested, these pillars arrange themselves in a perfect octagon around the ritual site, each standing precisely 88 feet tall and 8 feet in diameter. The surface of each pillar bears continuous animated engravings depicting different aspects of Khorne's martial philosophy. One shows dueling champions, another displays siege warfare, a third depicts ritual blood sacrifice, and so forth. The primary function of the pillars becomes apparent once the formation is complete. They create a localized environment where the barriers between real space and Khorne's domain grow exceptionally thin. Within this zone, the normal restrictions that limit demonic manifestation weaken significantly, allowing bloodletters, flesh hounds, and even bloodthirsters to materialize without the usual expenditure of warp energy or need for possession vessels. This effect essentially creates a sustainable beachhead for demonic forces, permitting much larger and more stable incursions than would normally be possible without a full-scale warp rift. Secondary effects of the pillars include environmental changes that favor Khorne's followers while disadvantaging their opponents. The ambient temperature within the formation rises significantly, creating desert-like conditions that sap enemy endurance. The ground gradually transmutes into a substance resembling the bone plains surrounding the brass citadel, becoming uneven and treacherous for those unfamiliar with fighting on such terrain. Most disturbingly, blood spilled within the pillar formation does not remain where it falls, but flows in unnatural patterns to form Khornate symbols that pulse with warp energy and occasionally spawn minor demons spontaneously. In the ever-shifting landscape of the Great Game, Khorne maintains complex relationships with his fellow Chaos gods that transcend simple rivalry. Each interaction reveals fundamental aspects of the Blood God's nature and highlights the philosophical contradictions inherent within Chaos itself. The eternal conflict between Khorne and Slaanesh represents perhaps the most fundamental opposition within the ruinous powers. These two deities embody diametrically opposed approaches to warfare and existence itself. Where Khorne values direct confrontation, Slaanesh revels in misdirection. Where the Blood God prizes effectiveness, the Prince of Pleasure seeks perfection. This opposition manifests most clearly on the battlefield, where Khornate berserkers charge directly at enemy lines, while Slaaneshi warriors dance through the flanks, each approach reflecting their patron's fundamental nature. The roots of this rivalry extend to the very emotions that feed these gods. Khorne draws power from rage in its purest form, the unthinking fury that drives warriors to continue fighting despite grievous injuries. Slaanesh, conversely, feeds on the exquisite emotional nuances of combat, the thrill of the perfect strike, the artistry of a well-executed maneuver, the sensual pleasure of dominating an opponent. These emotional foundations create incompatible approaches to violence that ensure perpetual conflict between their followers. In the realm of chaos, this rivalry manifests as an ever-shifting border, where blood-soaked plains gradually transform into landscapes of impossible beauty and sensory excess. Demonic armies clash along this boundary in battles that blend material and metaphorical warfare. Bloodletters advance in disciplined ranks against demonettes who move with hypnotic grace, each side embodying their patron's combat philosophy. The territory gained or lost in these engagements directly reflects the balance of power between rage and excess in the material universe. Despite this fundamental opposition, rare circumstances occasionally force temporary alliances between these incompatible powers. During Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, Khorne and Slaaneshi forces coordinated their assaults on imperial positions around the Cadian Gate, with blood god berserkers providing the hammer to the Prince of Pleasure's scalpel. Such cooperations remain purely pragmatic and dissolve the moment shared objectives are achieved, typically ending in bloodshed between the former allies. The relationship between Khorne and Nurgle presents a more complex dynamic, as these gods share certain philosophical commonalities despite their different approaches. Both deities embrace inevitability, Khorne through the certainty of violence in a contested galaxy, Nurgle through the inescapable cycle of decay and rebirth. Both gods also appreciate persistence, with Khorne valuing warriors who continue fighting despite overwhelming odds, while Nurgle blesses those who endure suffering without surrender. These shared values create a relationship best described as competitive rather than openly hostile. Where Khorne's legions meet Nurgle's plague armies in the realm of chaos, the battles unfold with a strange sense of mutual respect beneath the violence. Bloodletters hack at plaguebearers who simply absorb the damage and continue advancing, neither side gaining significant advantage. These engagements often conclude not with decisive victory, but with mutual withdrawal, once both forces have demonstrated sufficient commitment to their patron's principles. The material reflection of this relationship appears in how mortal followers of these gods interact. Khornate warbands typically avoid plague-infested worlds not from fear, but from pragmatic recognition that disease offers neither worthy combat nor clean skulls for collection. Nurgle's followers, meanwhile, generally avoid direct confrontation with Khorne's berserkers, preferring to let disease do their work rather than engaging in the direct combat the blood god favors. When circumstance forces these followers to fight directly, the engagements tend toward grueling wars of attrition that satisfy both gods' appreciation for endurance. The philosophical overlap between these powers occasionally creates individuals who attempt to walk both paths simultaneously. These rare champions typically begin their fall through one god's domain before incorporating elements of the other, creating hybrid worship patterns that draw limited blessings from both sources. Such individuals rarely achieve the highest ranks within either god's hierarchy, but can carve out specialized niches where their combined attributes prove particularly effective. The infamous plague Khornate of the Caligari sector exemplified this approach, combining Nurgle's resilience with Khorne's martial prowess to survive wounds that would have destroyed conventional berserkers. Of all the Chaos gods, Tzeentch stands as Khorne's most natural and vehement opponent. The Changer of Ways represents everything the blood god despises: sorcery over strength, manipulation over directness, complex schemes over honest combat. This opposition extends beyond simple rivalry into fundamental incompatibility, with each god's core philosophy directly contradicting the others. Where Khorne values the unchanging principles of martial honor, Tzeentch embraces constant mutation and adaptation. Where the blood god appreciates straightforward violence, the Lord of Change values victory through misdirection and deceit. This philosophical conflict manifests in how their respective demons interact within the warp. When Khorne's bloodthirsters encounter Tzeentch's Lords of Change, the battles transcend physical combat to become contests between opposing concepts. The bloodthirster strikes with direct force, embodying Khorne's belief in overwhelming power, while the Lord of Change shifts and transforms, representing Tzeentch's conviction that adaptation overcomes brute strength. These conflicts rarely end in conventional victory for either side. instead resolving when one concept temporarily gains ascendancy over the other in the collective consciousness of mortal races. The physical manifestation of this rivalry appears most clearly in how their followers approach warfare. Khorne's champions eschew psychic powers and complex strategies in favor of direct assault, while Tzeentch's servants rely on sorcery and elaborate tactical deceptions. When these forces clash in real space, the battlefield becomes a testing ground for their patrons' opposing philosophies. Khornate berserkers charge through sorcerous barriers through sheer determination, while Tzeentchian cultists redirect that aggression through illusions and misdirection. Each victory or defeat feeds back into the great game, strengthening or weakening the respective god's position. The most distinctive manifestation of Khorne's hatred for Tzeentch appears in the specialized anti-sorcery adaptations found throughout his forces. The collars of Khorne worn by flesh hounds specifically disrupt warp energies, making these creatures particularly effective against Tzeentchian sorcerers. Bloodthirsters of insensate rage generate null fields that temporarily suppress psychic abilities in their vicinity. Even mortal champions receive blessings that provide resistance against sorcerous attacks, their blood literally burning away enchantments that attempt to take hold in their flesh. Despite this fundamental opposition, circumstances occasionally force cooperation between these incompatible powers. During the Siege of Terra, Khornate and Tzeentchian demons fought alongside each other against the Imperial defenders, their mutual hatred temporarily superseded by shared objectives. Such alliances remain purely pragmatic and inherently unstable, with both sides constantly seeking advantage over their nominal allies. The moment shared goals are achieved, these forced partnerships inevitably dissolve into renewed conflict. The dynamics of the great game create situations where these gods form temporary alliances against common threats or particularly powerful rivals. The most common configuration pits Khorne and Nurgle against Tzeentch and Slaanesh, aligning gods of physicality against gods of concept and sensation. These alliances follow predictable patterns, with Khorne providing the direct assault force while Nurgle contributes attrition capabilities, opposed by Tzeentch's strategic manipulation, supported by Slaanesh's precision strikes. During the 13th Black Crusade, this pattern manifested in the coordinated assaults on Imperial Shrine worlds throughout the Cadian sector. Khornate berserkers and Nurgle plague marines formed the vanguard, breaking defensive lines through combination of fury and resilience. Behind them came the sorcerers of Tzeentch and sensory cultists of Slaanesh, exploiting the breaches to corrupt sacred sites according to their patrons' preferences. This cooperation lasted only until the primary objectives were secured, after which the temporary allies turned against each other to claim the spoils for their respective gods. The Siege of Terra during the Horus Heresy represented perhaps the most significant example of unified chaos action in Imperial history. All four Chaos gods contributed their power toward the single objective of overthrowing the Emperor, temporarily setting aside their eternal conflicts to eliminate their greatest mutual threat. Khorne's contribution appeared most visibly in the World Eater's Legion, by then fully committed to the Blood God's service. Their berserker assaults against the Imperial Palace walls created openings that cultists of the other gods exploited, demonstrating rare tactical coordination between these normally opposed forces. Even in this moment of apparent unity, the fundamental contradictions between the Chaos powers remained evident. Khornate forces focused on direct assaults against the strongest defensive positions, seeking worthy combat rather than strategic advantage. This approach frequently conflicted with the more calculated strategies favored by Tzeentchian commanders, creating friction within the traitor forces that ultimately contributed to their defeat. The aftermath of this failure saw the temporary alliance dissolve immediately, with the gods and their servants returning to their eternal conflicts with renewed vigor. The post-heresy era has seen few examples of genuine cooperation between Khorne and the other Chaos powers. The Black Crusades led by Abaddon the Despoiler represent the most significant instances, with the War Master's unique status as Servant of Chaos, undivided allowing him to temporarily direct the forces of all four gods toward common objectives. Even in these campaigns, Khornate elements typically operate semi-independently. coordinating with other Chaos forces only at the highest strategic level while maintaining separate tactical commands. The Blood God's relationship with the concept of Chaos Undivided remains particularly complex. Unlike his fellow Chaos gods who might occasionally see value in balanced worship, Khorne demands absolute dedication from his followers. Champions who attempt to walk multiple paths simultaneously rarely receive his highest blessings, as the Blood God views such divided loyalty as a form of weakness. This exclusivity creates tension with Abaddon's attempts to unite all Chaos forces under a single banner, as Khornate elements within these coalitions constantly push for more direct approaches that align with their patrons' preferences. This tension manifested clearly during the Siege of Vrax, where World Eater's warbands nominally operating under Abaddon's strategic direction frequently broke from the established battle plan to pursue targets they deemed more worthy of Khorne's attention. These deviations created opportunities for Imperial counterattacks that might have been avoided through stricter adherence to coordinated strategy. The Warmaster's ability to maintain even limited control over such forces speaks to his unique status within the hierarchy of Chaos, as few other commanders could prevent Khornate berserkers from simply attacking whatever presented the most immediate opportunity for bloodshed. The Blood God's relationship with mortal champions who attempt to balance multiple Chaos allegiances reveals another facet of his approach to the great game. While Khorne rarely grants significant favor to those who openly worship multiple gods, he occasionally tolerates limited divided loyalty from champions who demonstrate exceptional combat prowess. This pragmatic approach allows him to benefit from the service of warriors who might otherwise be lost to rival gods, while still maintaining his philosophical position regarding the superiority of undivided dedication. The infamous Chaos Lord Darlith of the Crimson Slaughter exemplifies this complex relationship. Though primarily dedicated to Khorne through his exceptional record of personal combat, Darlith maintains limited connections to Tzeentchian cults that provide strategic intelligence for his campaigns. The Blood God tolerates this arrangement because Darlith uses the information gained through these connections to identify particularly worthy targets for slaughter, ultimately serving Khorne's purposes more effectively than he could through blind berserker rage alone. This tolerance has limits, however, as Darlith carefully avoids employing sorcery personally, instead relying on subordinates to interface with his Tzeentchian contacts. Beyond the major Chaos gods, Khorne maintains adversarial relationships with minor warp entities that challenge his domain over martial combat. The Forge of Souls, a semi-independent warp consciousness associated with weapon creation, exists in a state of perpetual vassalage to the Blood God, providing specialized demonic weapons while maintaining limited autonomy. Drachnian, the echo of the first murder, represents a more complex case, an entity powerful enough to maintain independence from Khorne despite operating within his conceptual territory. The Blood God views such entities with suspicious tolerance, allowing their continued existence only so long as their activities ultimately contribute to the spread of violence across the galaxy. The practical manifestation of these complex relationships appears most clearly in how Khorne's forces operate when circumstances force them into proximity with servants of other gods. On campaigns where multiple Chaos factions pursue shared objectives, Khornate elements typically establish clear territorial boundaries, demanding exclusive control over front-line positions where they can engage enemies directly. They cede rear areas and support functions to other Chaos factions, creating a natural division of labor that minimizes direct interaction between potentially hostile forces. When battlefield developments force direct cooperation, Khornate champions establish explicit, time-limited agreements that terminate automatically once specified conditions are met. The Blood Tithe stands as the fundamental transaction between Khorne and his mortal followers. Unlike the complex intellectual puzzles demanded by Tzeentch or the elaborate sensory offerings required by Slaanesh, Khorne's requirements remain straightforward but exacting: blood spilled in combat, skulls taken from worthy opponents, and rage channeled through disciplined martial skill. The tithe functions as both literal and metaphysical exchange, with physical offerings creating psychic resonances that flow through the warp to Khorne's domain. The most basic form of the blood tithe involves the deliberate collection and offering of blood spilled in battle. Khornate cultists typically employ specialized equipment for this purpose: chalices forged from the weapons of defeated enemies, brass bowls inscribed with the eightfold symbol of Khorne, or in more primitive settings, the cupped hands of the devotee themselves. The collected blood must come primarily from combat rather than ritual sacrifice, though many cults supplement battlefield offerings with ceremonial bloodletting among their own warriors. The quality of blood offered directly affects the value of the tithe in Khorne's eyes. Blood from worthy opponents, skilled warriors who fought bravely until their end, carries significantly greater worth than that taken from civilians or those who surrendered. This valuation system creates a practical incentive for Khorne's followers to seek out the most formidable opponents rather than easy targets, explaining why Khornate warbands frequently target military installations rather than defenseless settlements when both options are available. For established Khornate cults, the blood tithe follows a precise hierarchy based on the 8 sacred numbers of Khorne. The most common pattern requires 8 warriors to contribute blood from 8 enemies each, collected by a champion who combines these offerings with blood from their personal kill. This combined offering then passes to a higher-ranking champion who aggregates blood from 8 such groups. This pattern continues upward through the cult hierarchy, with each level multiplying the symbolic value of the blood through its connection to Khorne's sacred numerology. The physical method of offering the collected blood varies widely across different Khornate traditions. The most direct approach involves simply pouring the blood onto ground consecrated to Khorne, typically at the base of a shrine featuring his skull rune symbol. More elaborate rituals might use specialized altars of brass and iron, constructed with channels that direct the blood flow into patterns matching significant constellations visible from the cult's homeworld. In void-based warbands, blood offerings often get vented directly into space, creating distinctive crimson clouds that surrounding imperial vessels have learned to recognize as warning signs of Khornate activity. Beyond the physical offering, the blood tithe includes a psychic component that transcends the material value of the blood itself. When properly consecrated, the blood serves as a conduit through which the emotions experienced during its collection, the rage of battle, the exhilaration of victory, the satisfaction of a worthy kill, flow directly to Khorne's domain. This emotional transfer provides the true sustenance the blood god seeks, with the physical blood merely serving as the medium for this more significant offering. While blood represents the process of killing, skulls embody the permanent record of victory and form the second major component of the blood tithe. The collection and preparation of skulls follows strict protocols within Khornate cults, with specific procedures based on the worthiness of the opponent. Skulls from especially notable enemies undergo elaborate preservation treatments, boiling to remove flesh, polishing with sand and blood to achieve a gleaming finish, and finally inscribing with the name of both victim and victor, along with the date and circumstances of the kill. The most prized skulls come from enemy champions, particularly those with psychic abilities whose defeat represents the triumph of martial prowess over sorcery. Space Marine librarians, Eldari farseers, and Orc weirdbuys rank especially high in this hierarchy, with their skulls often receiving special mounting on brass spikes or incorporation into personal armor as trophies. Skulls from Imperial saints or other individuals with connections to the Emperor hold particular value for Chaos Space Marines dedicated to Khorne, representing symbolic victories against their former master. The presentation of skull offerings typically occurs during specific astronomical alignments significant to the cult. Many Khornate groups observe the Night of Blood Moon, when their planet's moon appears red through atmospheric conditions, while void-based warbands might time their offerings to coincide with their vessel's passage through debris fields that scatter crimson light across their viewports. These timing considerations add another layer of meaning to the offering, connecting the microcosm of the cult's activities to the macrocosm of celestial movements. For Khornate champions seeking specific blessings, the blood tithe often takes more personalized forms. A warrior hoping for enhanced strength might offer skulls specifically from enemies known for their physical power, while one seeking improved combat speed might present trophies from particularly agile opponents. This sympathetic relationship between offering and desired blessing reflects the direct, transactional nature of Khorne's relationship with his followers, specific gifts given with clear expectations of specific returns. Beyond these physical offerings, the blood tithe includes less tangible but equally important components. The willingness to risk one's own blood in combat serves as a crucial element of proper worship, with Khorne showing particular favor to warriors who continue fighting despite grievous injuries. This aspect explains the common practice of ritualized scarification among Khornate cultists, who view their battle scars as visible proof of their commitment to the blood god's path. The most devoted followers sometimes incorporate brass or iron into these wound rituals, inserting metal fragments under their skin to create permanent symbols of their dedication. The number 8 permeates every aspect of Khornate ritual and organization, appearing with such consistency across different cults that imperial scholars suspect it carries intrinsic significance within the warp itself. The eightfold Path of Khorne represents the most basic manifestation of this numerology, with each point corresponding to a specific aspect of the blood god's martial philosophy: strength, courage, honor, wrath, endurance, skill, challenge, and victory. Initiates into Khornate cults progress through these stages sequentially, mastering each principle before advancing to the next. This eightfold structure extends to physical organization within Khornate forces. Squads typically contain 8 warriors led by a champion, who in turn reports to a lord commanding 8 such units. This pattern continues upward through the hierarchy, with each level maintaining the sacred number in its organization. When practical considerations require deviation from this structure, Khornate leaders ensure that the total still relates to 8 through multiplication or division, 16 warriors representing 2 groups of 8, or 4 representing half a sacred unit. The architectural design of Khornate shrines similarly reflects this numerological obsession. Temples typically feature octagonal floor plans with 8 supporting pillars and 8 steps leading to the central altar. Blood channels cut into the floor form 8 pointed stars that direct offerings toward the cardinal and ordinal directions. Even the ritual weapons used in ceremonies come in sets of 8, with each blade, axe, or hammer representing one aspect of Khorne's martial code. Calendar systems among Khornate cults divide the year into 8 seasons with 8 holy days in each, creating a 64-day cycle that repeats throughout the year. The most significant ceremonies occur at the transition points between these artificial seasons, with the change from the season of frost to the season of blood universally recognized as the most auspicious time for major offerings. This period typically coincides with the beginning of campaign season in temperate zones, when armies traditionally take to the field after winter quarters. The significance of 8 extends beyond simple counting to influence combat doctrine within Khornate forces. The preferred attack pattern involves 8 stages: approach, challenge, first blood, pursuit, full engagement, domination, execution, and collection. Warriors train extensively in this sequence, internalizing it until it becomes instinctive rather than conscious. Battle plans typically feature 8 phases with 8 alternative contingencies, creating tactical structures that satisfy religious requirements while maintaining military effectiveness. This numerological framework creates a distinctive psychological effect on both Khorne's followers and their opponents. For the devotees, the constant repetition of 8 throughout their lives provides a sense of cosmic order and purpose, reinforcing their belief that violence follows natural patterns rather than human caprice. For enemies facing Khornate forces, the uncanny precision with which this number appears, from the timing of attacks to the formation of units, creates a sense of confronting something beyond normal human motivation, contributing to the psychological impact of facing the blood god's servants. Blood tournaments represent perhaps the most structured form of devotion to Khorne, combining religious observance with practical combat training and hierarchical sorting. These events range from small-scale affairs involving single warbands to massive gatherings where multiple cults compete for Khorne's favor. The largest tournaments, typically held in the Eye of Terror or other warp-touched regions, sometimes attract direct attention from demonic observers sent by Khorne himself to identify promising champions. The basic format of these tournaments involves single combat between champions representing their respective warbands or cults. Fights typically continue until first blood for preliminary rounds, with later stages requiring more serious injuries or even death depending on the tournament's significance. Between formal matches, participating warriors engage in group melees or specialized combat challenges that test particular martial skills, weapon mastery, endurance, pain tolerance, or tactical adaptation. Unlike the chaotic free-for-alls that characterize many chaos gatherings, blood tournaments follow strict procedural rules enforced by designated judges, typically veteran champions with reputations for relative fairness. These judges determine match pairings, verify compliance with weapon restrictions, and most importantly, assess the quality of combat displayed. Warriors who rely on underhanded tactics or fail to demonstrate proper martial skill may find themselves disqualified or even designated as sacrifices regardless of their nominal victory. The weapons permitted in tournament combat vary according to local traditions and the specific aspect of Khorne being honored. Tournaments dedicated to Khorne as the Lord of Battles might allow full armor and primary weapons, while those celebrating him as the blood god might restrict participants to ritual daggers and minimal protection to maximize bloodshed. The most common format involves bladed weapons only, prohibiting ranged attacks or blunt instruments that fail to draw the blood Khorne desires. Beyond their religious significance, these tournaments serve practical functions within Khornate society. They provide controlled environments for settling disputes between warbands that might otherwise escalate into destructive conflicts that waste resources better used against external enemies. They create opportunities for warriors to demonstrate their skills before potential leaders looking to recruit new talent. Perhaps most importantly, they allow for the identification and elevation of exceptional individuals who might otherwise remain unrecognized within the rigid hierarchies of established cults. The gladiatorial traditions of ancient Terra find their most direct continuation in these Khornate combat rituals. Many blood tournaments incorporate elements drawn directly from historical records of the Ultramar gladiatorial games or the fighting pits of Old Night Terra, preserved by word-bearers who witnessed these events firsthand before their fall to chaos. These historical connections create a sense of continuity that appeals particularly to Chaos Space Marines from legions with strong ties to Terra's martial past. For mortal followers of Khorne, success in these tournaments represents one of the few paths to significant advancement within the cult hierarchy. A hive ganger or underhive scum who demonstrates exceptional combat prowess might find themselves elevated to leadership positions that would otherwise remain inaccessible, creating a meritocratic element within the otherwise rigid structure of Khornate organizations. This possibility of advancement helps explain the fanatical dedication many mortal cultists bring to their tournament preparation, often spending years honing specific techniques for their moment in the blood-soaked arena. Across the galaxy, human cultures have developed distinct regional variations in their worship of the blood god, each adapting Khorne's fundamental principles to their particular environmental and historical circumstances. These variations demonstrate the adaptability of chaos worship while maintaining the core elements that define Khorne's particular brand of devotion. On feral worlds, Khorne worship typically integrates with existing tribal structures, with the blood god simply replacing or absorbing local war deities. The Skull Hunters of Atram Necker exemplify this pattern, having transformed their traditional ancestor worship into a Khornate cult, where the skulls of worthy enemies serve as vessels for the spirits of dead warriors. Their blood rituals combine Imperial Guard deserters' knowledge of chaos symbolism with indigenous practices involving hallucinogenic plant substances that induce berserker rage states during combat. Hive world manifestations of Khorne worship often develop around gladiatorial traditions in underhive fighting pits. The Crimson Path gang of Necromundas, Hive Primus, began as simple pit fighters before their exposure to a damaged data slate containing fragments of the Book of Lorgar led them toward more formalized chaos worship. Their rituals emphasize urban combat skills and close quarters fighting techniques suited to the confined spaces of Hive environments, with their highest honor being the skull from above, a trophy taken from an upper Hive dweller who ventured into their territory. Forge worlds generate particularly disciplined variations of Khorne worship, with cults forming around the concept of perfected killing efficiency rather than berserker rage. The Brotherhood of the Brass Hand on Greyforge infiltrated multiple Mechanicus facilities before their discovery, creating a synthesis of Khorne worship and machine cult beliefs. Their rituals focus on the precision engineering of combat servitors designed specifically for tournament fighting, with successful designs receiving blood anointment that imbues their mechanical components with limited demonic essence. Void-based cultures develop distinctive forms of Khorne worship, adapted to the unique conditions of spacecraft and space stations. The Void Reavers operating throughout the Gothic sector practice what they term pressure offerings, ritualized breaches of hull integrity that expose victims to vacuum while collecting their blood in specialized containment fields before it can boil away. Their organization follows ship hierarchy patterns, with captains serving as high priests and engine crews forming a specialized subcult dedicated to the brass heart that they believe powers Khorne's flagship in the warp. Agricultural worlds with strong seasonal patterns often develop Khornate cults that align blood rituals with harvest cycles. The Reapers of Tanith Prime practiced a form of Khorne worship disguised as traditional harvest festivals, with ritual combat occurring alongside crop gathering and blood offerings made to ensure fertile fields for the following year. Their distinctive curved harvesting blades served dual purposes: agricultural tools during regular work and ritual weapons during ceremonies dedicated to the blood god. Death worlds generate particularly intense forms of Khorne worship due to the constant struggle for survival in hostile environments. The Skintakers of Catachan developed a variant Khornate cult that combines blood offerings with practical survival techniques, viewing the planet's deadly flora and fauna as Khorne's agents testing their worthiness. Their rituals involve combat against captured predator species, with successful warriors earning the right to incorporate elements of the defeated creature, toxin sacs, chitinous plates, or specialized hunting organs, into their own bodies through crude surgical procedures. Feudal worlds with night cultures provide fertile ground for Khorne worship that emphasizes martial honor alongside bloodshed. The Crimson Jousters of Avalonia maintain the outward appearance of traditional night houses while secretly dedicating their tournament victories to Khorne. Their distinctive practice of blood heraldry involves painting armor with the blood of defeated opponents, creating elaborate patterns that knowledgeable observers can read as a record of specific victories and sacrifices made to the blood god. The most divergent forms of Khorne worship develop on worlds with minimal imperial contact, where cults evolve without direct guidance from established chaos sources. The Blood Moons of Perdita Secundus developed their traditions independently after discovering ancient cave paintings left by a crashed World Eater's vessel during the Horus Heresy. Their understanding of Khorne bears only passing resemblance to mainstream worship, viewing the blood god as a celestial hunter who pursues worthy prey across the night sky, with shooting stars representing his thrown spear striking down chosen targets. The blood tide of Vrax stands as perhaps the most comprehensive manifestation of Khorne's influence in recent imperial history. What began as a relatively straightforward siege against a heretical cardinal's fortress armory in the year 813 of the 41st millennium devolved into a 17-year nightmare when Alpha Legion operatives orchestrated a full-scale chaos uprising. By the campaign's 5th year, the conflict had drawn the attention of multiple Khornate warbands, including elements of the World Eater's Legion led by the infamous warlord Jufer, known as the Butcher of Vrax. The true turning point came in the campaign's 9th year when Imperial forces breached the inner defensive lines, inadvertently triggering ancient chaos devices buried beneath the Cardinal's palace. These artifacts, dormant since the Horus Heresy, created a localized weakening of the barrier between real space and the warp. The resulting phenomenon, dubbed the Blood Tide by surviving Imperial witnesses, manifested as a literal wave of blood-colored warp energy that swept across the battlefield, transforming everything it touched. Imperial guardsmen caught in the Blood Tide underwent horrific transformations, their bodies warping as uncontrolled rage overtook their minds. Weapons fused with limbs, flesh hardened into makeshift armor, and in many cases, soldiers turned on their comrades in frenzied assaults that broke entire regiments. Commissars reported being forced to execute entire platoons of affected troops, only to find themselves succumbing to the same battle madness moments later. The Blood Tide's effects extended beyond human targets. Vehicles touched by the crimson energy developed grotesque, organic components, tank treads resembling muscle fibers, gun barrels that pulsed like arteries, and targeting systems that locked onto the strongest available opponents rather than the most tactically significant. The phenomenon reached its apex when a Baneblade super heavy tank, the Iron God, developed a primitive consciousness driven solely by Khornate impulses, breaking from Imperial control to rampage across the battlefield for 3 days before Death Corps engineers managed to disable it with Melta charges. As the Blood Tide stabilized, it created conditions perfect for demonic manifestation. The first entities to materialize were packs of flesh hounds, emerging from blood pools that formed in shell craters across no man's land. These demonic hunters immediately began tracking down and eliminating Imperial psychers, targeting sanctioned psychers attached to guard regiments, and even the astropathic choir maintaining communication with the sector command. The demonic incursion escalated when a warband of World Eaters conducted a mass sacrifice of prisoners, using their blood to create a temporary warp portal through which emerged a full Bloodletter Legion led by the bloodthirster Angrath the Unbound. Standing nearly 20 meters tall, this greater demon personally destroyed 3 titans of the Legio Vulcanum, tearing apart their void shields with his bare hands before dismembering the war machines with his massive axe, the blood-dark axe of Khorne. The Ordo Malleus responded by deploying a full brotherhood of Grey Knights under the command of Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex. The resulting battle between Angrath and the Grey Knights remains classified at the highest levels, but fragmented reports indicate that only through the sacrifice of an entire Terminator squad and the use of a specialized anti-demonic weapon known as the Blade of the Emperor's Light was the Bloodthirster finally banished back to the warp. Even after Angrath's defeat, the Blood Tide's effects lingered. Geological surveys conducted after the war revealed that the very bedrock of Vrax had been altered, with stone formations resembling skulls and bone emerging from previously normal terrain. Groundwater across the northern continent turned permanently red and slightly viscous, while metal structures throughout the war zone developed rust patterns that formed Khornate symbols when viewed from certain angles. The planet remains under permanent quarantine, with the Inquisition maintaining a research facility in orbit to monitor the continuing manifestations. The wars for Armageddon, particularly the Third War, presented another significant theater for Khornate demonic activity. While the conflict is primarily remembered as a massive orc war led by Gazkul Thraka, Imperial records document substantial chaos involvement, with Khorne's forces playing a particularly devastating role in the campaign's middle phases. The initial Khornate incursion coincided with the orc assault on Hive Infernus, when a chaos cult calling themselves the Bloodborne activated a series of warp-attuned devices beneath the Hive's main manufactorum. The resulting reality breach allowed a host of Bloodletters to materialize directly inside Imperial defensive positions, bypassing the carefully prepared kill zones established to counter the orc advance. This perfectly timed assault suggests coordination between the Orc Wa and Chaos forces, though whether this represents actual alliance or merely opportunistic exploitation remains debated among Ordo Malleus analysts. The Bloodletter's attack pattern demonstrated uncharacteristic restraint for Khorne's forces, focusing specifically on command and control assets rather than engaging in indiscriminate slaughter. Vox relay stations, tactical operations centers, and senior officer bunkers suffered targeted strikes that effectively decapitated the Hive's defensive coordination. This surgical approach suggests the direct influence of a higher intelligence, possibly a bloodthirster of the wrath and glory variant known for their strategic acumen rather than simple battlefield fury. As the Bloodletter assault disrupted Imperial command structures, a second Khornate force emerged from the Underhive, cultists who had been preparing for this moment for generations. These human worshippers, led by a figure calling himself the Skull Cardinal, seized control of the Hive's water purification systems and introduced a warp-tainted compound that induced extreme aggression in those who consumed it. Within hours, civilian riots erupted across mid-Hive residential sectors, creating a three-front war for the already overwhelmed defenders. The Space Marines of the Salamanders chapter, responding to the Hive's distress call, encountered a new threat as they attempted to establish a landing zone, Flesh Hounds specifically targeting their Thunderhawk gunships. These demonic hunters demonstrated the ability to track the aircraft despite active camouflage systems, suggesting they were following the psychic scent of the Marines' navigators rather than relying on conventional senses. Only through the self-sacrifice of Navigator Patrius, who deliberately overloaded his third eye to create a psychic flare that disoriented the Flesh Hounds, did the main Salamander's force manage to land intact. The situation deteriorated further when a massive blood-red vortex formed above Hive Infernus, a manifestation later identified as a warp rift specifically attuned to Khorne's domain. From this swirling portal descended 8 bloodthirsters riding chariots of brass pulled by juggernauts. These greater demons did not join the battle directly, but instead took positions surrounding the Hive, where they began an elaborate ritual that Imperial scholars later determined was designed to transform the entire Hive into a permanent Khornate stronghold in real space. The ritual's effects became apparent as the very architecture of Hive Infernus began to transform. Hab blocks twisted into shapes resembling skulls, roadways rearranged into the 8-pointed Star of Chaos, and metal surfaces throughout the Hive exuded a red fluid indistinguishable from human blood. Most disturbing were reports that statues and imperial monuments spontaneously recarved themselves into images glorifying slaughter, with some witnesses claiming these stone figures moved when not directly observed. The combined efforts of the Salamanders, Grey Knights Strike Force Thawne, and elements of the Steel Legion eventually disrupted the ritual through the deployment of specially modified null field generators developed by Magos Biology's Heron Serpents based on captured Necron technology. The generators created expanding zones of reality stabilization that forced the Bloodthirsters to expend increasing amounts of warp energy to maintain both the ritual and their own manifestation in real space. This strategy proved costly. 3 of the null generators were destroyed by Khornate counterattacks, and 2 Grey Knight squads were lost securing the others, but ultimately succeeded in collapsing the warp rift and banishing the greater demons. The aftermath of the Khornate incursion left Hive Infernus permanently tainted. Despite extensive purification efforts, including the complete replacement of the water purification system and the demolition of structures that had undergone the most severe transformations, subtle chaos influence persisted. Commissar reports noted an 18% increase in violent disciplinary incidents among troops stationed in the recovered zones, while civilian crime statistics showed a marked shift toward blood crimes, murders, assaults, and ritualistic violence, in patterns that formed Khornate symbols when mapped across Hive sectors. The Ordo Malleus maintains a permanent monitoring post in Hive Infernus disguised as an Adeptus Arbites precinct, with orders to initiate exterminatus protocols at the first sign of renewed demonic activity. The Kohler Cost Blood Crusade represents perhaps the most purely Khornate campaign in recent Imperial history, distinguished from other Chaos incursions by its singular dedication to the Blood God without the diluting influence of other Chaos powers. Beginning in the sanguinary worlds of the Forsar sector in the 945th year of the 41st millennium, the Crusade began when a coalition of Khornate warbands led by the demon prince Skulltaker united under a single blood-red banner bearing the brass symbol of their god. The Crusade's first target, the the shrine world of Salandraxxus, fell in a single night of coordinated assault. The Khornate forces deliberately avoided damaging the planet's primary cathedral, instead conducting a mass sacrifice of the entire ecclesiastical population on the cathedral's high altar. The blood from thousands of slain priests, nuns, and pilgrims flowed through channels in the floor originally designed for decorative water features, filling a basin that inquisitorial researchers later determined had been secretly modified centuries earlier by Khorne cultists within the ecclesiarchy. When the basin filled completely, it served as a warp portal through which emerged the Kholorkost itself, a semi-sentient tide of blood that could dissolve flesh on contact while preserving skulls for collection. This demonic phenomenon became the Crusades' primary weapon as it spread across the sector. On each conquered world, the Kholorkost absorbed the blood of slain populations, growing in volume and potency with each victory. Planetary defense forces found conventional weapons largely ineffective against what was essentially a fluid entity. Flamers and thermal weapons caused portions of the Kholorkost to evaporate temporarily, but ultimately only dispersed it over wider areas. Force fields proved similarly ineffective, as the demonic fluid found ways to seep through microscopic gaps or simply flow around barrier projectors. The Crusades' path through Imperial space followed a precise pattern that initially baffled strategic analysts. Rather than targeting militarily significant worlds or following efficient transit routes, the Khornate fleet moved in what appeared to be random zigzags across the sector. Only when Ordo Malleus cartographers overlaid the campaign route on ancient star charts did the pattern become clear. The Crusade was tracing the constellation known in pre-imperial mythology as the Butcher, creating a massive Khornate symbol across real space that would be visible from neighboring sectors. The Blood Crusade's fleet composition demonstrated the diversity of Khorne's mortal servants. World Eater's warbands formed the elite vanguard, their ships easily identified by the skulls physically bolted to their hulls and the distinctive red contrails their engines produced in the warp. Supporting these Astartes vessels came hundreds of captured Imperial craft crewed by mortal cultists, many modified with brutal ram prows designed for void combat. Most disturbing were the blood ships, vessels that appeared to be composed of crystallized blood surrounding a core of brass, which Imperial augurs could barely detect, and which seemed capable of materializing directly from the warp without using conventional entry points. The Crusades' momentum seemed unstoppable until it reached the fortress world of Havlat Prime, where the Imperial defense was led by Chapter Master Tushan of the Salamanders. Recognizing the demonic nature of the Kholorkost, Tushan implemented a strategy based on ancient texts recovered from the Librarium Sanctorum on Terra. Rather than attempting to destroy the blood tide directly, the Salamanders created a network of consecrated ground using a combination of technologies: null field generators, sacred oils blessed by the Legion of the Damned during their brief manifestation on the planet's moon, and a modified version of the Sisters of Battle's faith shield generators. When the Kholorkost flowed into this prepared battlefield, it found itself channeled into increasingly narrow corridors of unconsecrated ground. At the center of this labyrinth waited Tushan with the Spear of Vulcan, an artifact weapon not seen since the Horus Heresy. The Chapter Master plunged this relic into the concentrated essence of the Kholorkost, creating a chain reaction that Imperial scholars still cannot fully explain. Witnesses described a column of fire erupting from the point of impact, burning with the black flame characteristic of Vulcan's forged craft, which consumed the demonic fluid while leaving everything else untouched. The destruction of the Kholorkost broke the momentum of the Blood Crusade, but the campaign continued in more conventional form, with the remaining Khornate forces fighting a bloody path through the sector before Imperial reinforcements finally contained them. The crusade ended not with a decisive Imperial victory, but with the sudden withdrawal of the Chaos forces, who abandoned ongoing planetary assaults to return to the warp. Inquisitorial agents later determined that this abrupt departure coincided with the completion of the star pattern they had been tracing. Having fulfilled their symbolic purpose, the Khornate forces considered their mission accomplished regardless of military outcome. The formation of the Great Rift in the early 42nd millennium fundamentally altered the balance of power throughout the galaxy, and nowhere was this shift more evident than in the expanding influence of the Blood God. As the Cicatrix Maledictum tore reality apart, it created unprecedented opportunities for Khorne's followers to spread carnage across weakened Imperial worlds. The Immaterium bled into real space along the vast wound stretching from the Eye of Terror to the eastern fringe, allowing Khornate forces to manifest with greater ease and in larger numbers than at any time since the Horus Heresy. In the Imperium Nihilus, cut off from the Emperor's light by the Great Rift, conditions proved especially favorable for Khorne's influence. Desperate populations facing Xeno's invasions, resource shortages, and isolation turned to increasingly extreme measures for protection. Imperial records from worlds like Vigilus documented the rise of gladiatorial cults that initially presented themselves as civilian defense forces before gradually incorporating blood rituals and skull-taking practices. The Indomitus Crusade discovered entire systems where planetary governors had instituted blood tithes alongside the imperial tithe, sacrificing portions of their population in desperate attempts to appease the growing warp presence they could feel pressing against reality. The Blood God's legions exploited these conditions with methodical precision. Demon worlds within the Eye of Terror that had long served as bases for Khornate warbands now found themselves connected to vulnerable Imperial territories through warp corridors that bypassed traditional defensive choke points. The berserkers of Scalathrax, previously limited in their operational range by warp travel difficulties, launched simultaneous assaults across multiple sectors, suggesting a level of strategic coordination unusual for followers of Khorne. Astropathic communications intercepted by inquisitorial agents indicated that these attacks specifically targeted worlds with high concentrations of psychers or strong connections to the Emperor's faith, reflecting Khorne's traditional enmity towards sorcery and rival divine powers. The material manifestation of Khorne's increased influence appeared most dramatically in the phenomenon known as blood rains. On worlds near the Great Rift, precipitation took on the consistency and appearance of blood, falling from skies the color of burnished brass. Biological analysis of these rains revealed a complex composition that defied conventional understanding. The liquid contained genetic markers from thousands of different species, including some unknown to Imperial taxonomists, all somehow preserved in viable condition despite the impossibility of such stability. More disturbing were the psychological effects on populations exposed to these rains, with affected individuals reporting dreams of battle and developing increased aggression that eventually culminated in violent outbursts precisely 8 days after initial exposure. Khorne's followers demonstrated remarkable adaptability in response to the Primaris Space Marines deployed throughout the Indomitus Crusade. Traditional Khornate tactics had evolved to counter standard Astartes' capabilities, but the enhanced physiology and advanced equipment of Primaris Marines initially proved challenging for berserker assault patterns. The Blood God's champions responded by developing specialized counter techniques, particularly against Gravis armor, which offered unprecedented protection against the chain weapons favored by World Eater's warbands. The Crimson Slaughter, a Khornate warband operating along the edges of the Nachman Gauntlet, pioneered new combat approaches specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in Primaris tactical doctrine. Their berserkers now carried modified chain weapons with adamantium-tipped teeth capable of finding purchase in the joints of Gravis armor, while their terminators adopted a fighting style that deliberately targeted the advanced auto-senses of Primaris helmets with sensory overload devices. Most concerning to Ordo Malleus observers was the emergence of blood magic rituals that seemed specifically attuned to the genetically enhanced nature of Primaris Marines, allowing Khornate sorcerers to track Primaris deployment patterns through the unique resonance of their modified gene seed. The resurgence of the Silent King and his efforts to reunite the Necron dynasties presented a unique challenge to Khorne's forces. The soulless nature of Necrons made them fundamentally unsatisfying opponents in the Blood God's eyes. They provided neither blood for the Blood God nor skulls for the Skull Throne in any meaningful sense. This metaphysical incompatibility created a strategic blind spot in Khornate operations, with many warbands deliberately avoiding Necron tomb worlds even when they presented tactical opportunities. The Blood God's response to this emerging threat revealed unexpected depth to his strategic thinking. Rather than direct confrontation, Khorne's most sophisticated servants adopted an approach of weaponized proxy conflicts. On worlds like Adrantz II, where Necron forces engaged with Imperial defenders, Khornate cultists infiltrated Imperial command structures not to destroy them, but to prolong the conflict, ensuring maximum bloodshed between forces that could provide proper tribute. In several documented cases, Khornate warbands actually protected Imperial supply lines when their destruction would have led to a quick Necron victory, preferring to maintain a bleeding wound rather than allow a clean kill that would end the flow of blood prematurely. When direct confrontation with Necron forces proved unavoidable, Khorne's champions developed specialized tactics focused on their commanders. The blood of higher-ranking Necrons, particularly overlords who retained some vestige of their ancient personalities, proved marginally acceptable to the Blood God when collected under specific ritual conditions. The Skullrippers of the Charadon sector became particularly adept at this specialized hunting, developing weapons designed to pierce the quantum phase shifting abilities of Necron nobility and contain the energy released upon their destruction in blood-consecrated receptacles. The most significant adaptation came through the emergence of specialized demon engines designed specifically for anti-Necron warfare. The brass scorpions deployed against Necron forces incorporated technology scavenged from the Mechanicum's most ancient vaults, including components that predated the dark age of technology and showed design influences, suggesting origin in the war in heaven itself. These modified engines demonstrated the ability to disrupt the reanimation protocols of standard Necron warriors, creating permanent casualties that satisfied Khorne's demand for decisive victory rather than the endless stalemate that typically characterized engagements with the self-repairing Xenos. The introduction of Belisarius Cael's Primaris technology prompted a parallel innovation among Khorne's forces, particularly those Chaos Space Marine warbands with access to Dark Mechanicum support. Captured Primaris Marines became subjects for extensive experimentation, with Khornate apothecaries seeking to reverse engineer Cael's enhancements for application to their own warriors. These efforts produced mixed results, with many test subjects dying from gene seed incompatibility or succumbing to uncontrollable mutations when exposed to warp energies during the enhancement process. The most successful adaptations emerged from the Butcher Horde, a specialized World Eaters splinter faction led by the Demon Prince Vraka the Blessed. Their Crimson Primaris program combined salvaged Belisarius Cael technology with modified Butcher's Nails implants and direct blood infusion from demons of Khorne. The resulting warriors stood taller than traditional Chaos Space Marines, with enhanced musculature and bone density that allowed them to wield oversized chain weapons previously mounted only on vehicles or dreadnoughts. Their modified neural architecture channeled the traditional berserker rage of World Eaters into focused killing efficiency rather than mindless fury, creating combatants who maintained tactical awareness even at the height of battle frenzy. Imperial encounters with these enhanced Khornate warriors proved particularly costly during the Baal Resurgence campaign, where elements of the Blood Angels attempting to secure outlying systems following the devastation of Baal found themselves facing opponents who matched their strength while exceeding their aggression. The traditional Blood Angels' advantage in close-quarter combat diminished significantly against these specialized adversaries, forcing Chapter Master Dante to develop new combined arms approaches that kept the enhanced berserkers at range rather than engaging them directly. The prophesied conflicts between Khorne's champions and the forces of order have taken on new urgency in the waning days of the Imperium. Ancient prognostications from the Liber Malefic, compiled during the early years of the Horus Heresy, speak of 8 blooded challenges that must occur before the final dissolution of the Emperor's realm. Inquisitorial scholars note with growing concern that 3 of these prophesied conflicts have already transpired in the years since the Great Rift's formation. The first challenge occurred at the Fortress of Hera on Muck Crag, where a bloodthirster identified as Kajak the Bloodborne manifested during a ceremony honoring the returned Primarch Robute Guilliman. The demon's attack, though ultimately repelled by the combined efforts of the Victrix Guard and a Grey Knight strike team, fulfilled the prophecy's description of the Angel of Blood who challenges the returned statesman in his moment of ascension. The timing and specificity of this assault suggested direct involvement from Khorne himself, rather than merely opportunistic demonic activity. The second prophesied challenge manifested during the Battle of the Ark's Gap on Vigilus, where the Butcher Horde's enhanced berserkers engaged with elements of the White Scars in what Imperial tacticians later identified as a ritual combat pattern rather than a strategically sound assault. The berserkers deliberately formed an 8-pointed star formation during their advance, sacrificing tactical advantage to maintain symbolic alignment. The White Scars' victory, achieved through superior mobility rather than direct confrontation, inadvertently completed the ritual pattern described in the Liber Malefic as the swift ones who dance with the blood tide but refuse its embrace. The third challenge, perhaps most concerning to Ordo Malleus analysts, occurred not on a battlefield, but within the dreams of psychers across the Imperium Sanctus. For 8 consecutive nights following the reinforcement of the Cadian Gate, astropaths and sanctioned psychers reported identical nightmares featuring 8 champions of Khorne challenging them to ritual combat. Those who accepted the challenge in their dreams, even in defiance, never awakened, while their bodies underwent spontaneous transformation, their skulls reshaping into brass replicas that transmitted demonic communications when touched by unprotected hands. This mass psychic event matched the prophecy's description of the sleeping challenge that separates the worthy seers from the false. 5 prophesied challenges remain unfulfilled, with the final one described in particularly disturbing terms. And the 8th shall face the Golden One upon his throne of pain, and from their combat shall the universe know its true master. The identity of this Golden One remains debated among inquisitorial scholars, with the most obvious interpretation suggesting the Emperor himself, while others argue for alternative candidates including the Custod's Captain General or even the Silent King of the Necrons, whose living metal body bears a golden sheen. Preparations for these coming conflicts have driven Khorne's forces to unprecedented levels of organization and purpose. The traditional independence of Khornate warbands has given way to looser confederations united by shared ritual purposes rather than direct command structures. The Crimson Path, a coalition of previously unaligned Khornate forces, now coordinates activities across multiple sectors through blood-bound emissaries who transmit the blood gods will through ritualized combat demonstrations rather than verbal orders. The most significant development in Khorne's approach to the coming apocalypse has been the emergence of the 8 Chosen, champions drawn from different aspects of the blood god's domain who appear to be positioning themselves to fulfill the remaining prophesied challenges. Each bears a portion of Khorne's power, channeled through artifacts of unprecedented potency, and their appearances on battlefields throughout the Imperium have shown disturbing synchronicity despite no apparent direct communication between them. Arbiter the Judge, formerly Captain Carden of the Brazen Consuls chapter, leads a warband that specifically targets Imperial judicial facilities, Arbites precincts, inquisitorial courts, and execution grounds. His armor, constructed from the melted-down badges of 1,000 judges, grants him the ability to perceive every crime committed by those in his presence, which he punishes with precisely measured violence, never killing quickly, but ensuring that blood loss exactly matches the severity of the transgression. The Skull Reaver, a demon prince who once served as an Iron Warrior's warsmith, has emerged as Khorne's siege specialist, focusing exclusively on sanctuary locations, cathedrals, hospitals, and civilian shelters. His massive thunder hammer, forged from the compressed skulls of 100 Imperial saints, creates impact patterns that form Khornate symbols regardless of the surface struck. Imperial defenders have noted his attacks follow a precise mathematical pattern that maximizes civilian casualties while leaving enough survivors to spread terror. Valkia the Bloody, one of the few female champions to achieve prominence in Khorne's traditionally male-dominated hierarchy, leads a specialized hunting force targeting psykers and faith leaders. Her spear, Sleipnir, possesses the unique ability to pierce psychic defenses as easily as physical ones, allowing her to wound the immaterial essence of her targets alongside their bodies. Particularly concerning to Imperial authorities is her practice of converting rather than killing many of her victims, creating a growing network of compromised psykers who maintain their positions within Imperial organizations while secretly serving Khorne. The remaining 5 chosen maintain lower profiles, appearing only briefly on scattered battlefields before returning to the warp. Their coordinated movements suggest preparation for a synchronized assault that will fulfill the remaining prophesied challenges simultaneously rather than sequentially, potentially overwhelming Imperial defensive capabilities through sheer geographic distribution of threats. As the Imperium faces these emerging threats from Khorne's forces, the fundamental nature of conflict itself seems to be shifting. Battle reports from the Indomitus Crusade increasingly note phenomena that transcend conventional warfare: weapons that wound the soul alongside the body, battlefields that retain psychic imprints of violence for years after conflict's end, and most disturbingly, increasing evidence that death in combat against Khorne's forces prevents proper transition of the soul to the Emperor's care, instead redirecting the spiritual essence of the fallen directly to the blood god's domain. The era Indomitus thus represents not merely another chapter in the endless war for the galaxy, but potentially the final phase of Khorne's long game, a culmination of plans set in motion during the earliest days of human civilization. As the prophesied challenges unfold, and the barriers between real space and the warp continue to thin, the blood god's influence grows beyond mere violence into something more fundamental, a restructuring of reality itself around principles of eternal conflict, where peace becomes not merely elusive but metaphysically impossible. The blood god watches these developments from his brass throne with something approaching satisfaction, if such a human emotion can be attributed to such an entity. Each skull added to his throne, each drop of blood spilled in his name, brings the universe one step closer to the state of perfect,